Hey, welcome everybody. My name is Mark Medeiros. I'm the Community Engagement Manager at Peninsula Open Space Trust, and we'd like to welcome you to tonight's program on outdoor survival and how to avoid needing those outdoor survival skills that we're going to teach you tonight. Very excited that you're all here. Thanks for saying hello in chat. Glad many of you are joining. Before we start, quickly, I wanted to mention and acknowledge that the lands in post-working area have been home to many distinct communities of Native people since time immemorial. This is the ancestral territory of the Amamutsun, Muekma Ohlone, and Ramaytush Ohlone, as well as many individuals of various tribal affiliations and indigenous groups who are still with us today. These indigenous communities are the past, present, and future caretakers of this land. Wherever you are, please pause to acknowledge the Native people whose land you are on. Feel free to mention their names in chat, and we welcome any members of the Native communities today. So, very quickly, for those of you who are less familiar with post-work, we are a 501c3 nonprofit land trust that has been working in the Bay Area since 1977, mainly San Mateo and Santa Clara counties, a little bit of northern Santa Cruz County. And to date, we have protected over 80,000 acres of land. Thank you to the many donors and community members who have made this work possible. It's absolutely because of you that we have been so successful over the years. And the vast majority of these lands are publicly accessible. There are various preserves as part of the Mid-Penn or OSA or Santa Clara or San Mateo County Parks, state parks, preserves and park systems that you could visit and enjoy. We know that every year more and more people are going out to these places and recreating, going on hikes, bike riding, and many of them are pretty close to home and pretty simple to navigate. Others can take you pretty far afield into pretty rugged terrain where there's no cell reception or various trails where you could get lost. And we know many of our followers like to go into backcountry areas like our national forests, Henrico State Park, other areas like that. So we thought that it would be useful to a lot of you to learn some outdoor survival skills and a framework for how to stay safe outside. And we found somebody really great to teach you some new skills. And that person is Jack Harrison. He's a survival instructor, an outdoor educator, and survival expert based in Santa Cruz. Jack works with various emergency response professionals, as well as members of the public, conducting various types of workshops, wilderness and outdoor related workshops, about different emergency scenarios. And this is his lifelong passion, working with people to introduce them to the outdoors. He studies wildlife tracking, bushcraft, ancestral life skills, and he offers his own private lessons. You can see his website there, jackharrisonsurvival.com. He also works with a great organization called Adventure Out that you could look into and learn about all sorts of workshops that they offer as well. So with that, I'm going to welcome Jack to the program. Hey, Jack, how are you doing, man?
Hey, Mark. Thanks again for having me.
Yeah, I am super excited for what you have to share tonight. I know a lot of folks are too. I wanted to just ask you, for folks who haven't heard about you, can you say a little bit about what brought you to this work, why you're passionate about it?
Yeah. So I've been teaching, as you'll find out, I've been teaching survival my entire adult life. And it's just been something from a young age that I always wanted to do and was always very curious about, all things nature. And I just felt like that was the important information that I needed to learn, specifically when it came to just living outside. And so, I've just sort of focused on that. That's just literally been my career path, and I've never had another desire as far as what I wanted to do with my life, my entire life. And I've been very fortunate to now have been teaching since like 2006, professionally. And
Wow.
yeah, I'm really excited to share with everybody. I teach classes here in Santa Cruz, and actually just came back, just came out of the field. I was teaching a couple overnight classes, where we had students sleeping in debris shelters, which is a shelter we're going to be talking about here. We were making fire with sticks and cooking food over the fire and foraging and all that fun stuff.
That's amazing. Yeah, you were sharing that. It was this week, right? When we had the
Yeah.
places we got hail, it was super cold. So
Yeah. Yeah. It was like mid to high 20s all of a sudden, and raining and hailing through the
wow.
evening. It was really, really great weather actually to be out there
Yeah,
testing these skills. So
for sure.
yeah.
Um, great. It's thanks for sharing all that. And for the audience, I just want to say we've been working on this presentation, going over it. I think many of you will be surprised, by what Jack has to offer. We'll be talking about some specifics, what you should carry and that sort of thing. But really, it's a framework, right? That you're going to be walking people through.
Yeah.
Uh, a framework to keep in mind to help you prepare. So I think you all are going to like it a lot. I want to tell you folks that there's a chance we might run over a little bit. If we do, never fear. There will be a recording that you could review later if you have to leave after 8. So not quite sure about when we'll end. So there's that. And we do have an active chat, so we hope you could join us there, and we'll be taking questions at the end. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jack. You can get your slides ready.
All right.
And while you're doing that, I'm just going to ask you all in chat, if you have a story of getting lost or getting stuck outside at night, share it with the group. I'd love to hear your stories too. So, all right, Jack. So your slides are ready. I'm going to turn it over to you, man. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. So thanks again to Mark and Post for arranging this. I'm really excited to be sharing all this with y'all. And as somebody who works in the outdoor field and spends all their time outside, making a PowerPoint presentation was a new thing for me. So I'm looking forward to sharing my masterpiece with y'all, or that's what I'm calling it, although it might be a little bit simple by some standards. So let's get into it. So I briefly touched on, who I am, and I'll just quickly go over this. This is a photograph of me as a teenager, making fire with 2 sticks. It's called the hand drill technique. And so I started teaching survival professionally at 18 years old, which was in 2006. Through my work with a company called Adventure Out, I've been very fortunate to work with a number of different first responder crews, from California Highway Patrol, Air Rescue, to search and rescue, to medevac teams, Nevada Search and Rescue, and some inspiring thinkers and celebrities like Tim Ferriss and a number of other very high profile folks, as well as some military and ex-military. But I'd have to say that what I'm most proud of is just having taught personally having personally trained more than 15,000 folks in my career. And that's a pretty conservative number there. It's hard to really quantify, but I love teaching people about survival. And more importantly, I love teaching them about nature, because as you'll find out, I believe learning about nature and survival are very much intertwined. So that's me. This is what I love to do. It's my job. That's all I do, is I teach survival. So an outline of the presentation that I put together for y'all today is we're going to talk about how survival situations happen, what we can do to reduce the odds of ending up in a survival situation. We're going to talk about, if we do get lost, what should we do to stay safe until rescue arrives? Like, do I stay? Do I go? We're going to talk about preparedness and how we can be best prepared for an unforeseen camping trip. What I like to call these are or survival situations. I like to just call them inconvenient camping trips. But I understand for some folks that, it could be a pretty traumatic, scary experience. And then we're also going to talk about, we're going to spend quite a bit of time on what are our biological needs, right? Because survival is essentially procuring your biological needs from the environment that you're in. Now, that could be urban, that could be, in the ocean, that could be, hypothetically in space, like, wherever you are, you still have the same biological needs, and survival is getting those needs from the landscape you're in. After addressing any emergency medical needs. And we're not going to be talking about wilderness medicine here because I'm not qualified to do that. But we are going to be coming at this from an approach of, or my approach, which is the more you know, the less you need. And for me, survival is really about connecting to the landscape that you're in. I've gotten the most out of just learning about the place that I'm in and really spending a lot of time out there, getting to know the plants, getting to know the animals, because when you do that, you realize that truly everything you need to survive is there. You just have to learn how to access it. And we're going to be talking about some practical things too that you can do immediately after this. But my emphasis is on learning about the landscape. And this is a female mountain lion that snuck up on me on a beautiful morning about a year ago, and we had a wonderful interaction. I took this photograph with my phone. Super pleasant. Once she realized I was a human, she left, but we had a little stare down for about 20 minutes. And she was about 4 to 4.5 years old. You can tell from the dark marks on the inside of her arms. And then from a different angle, the tick scars on her back. So let's start. What are survival situations? Let's just define what a survival situation is for this presentation. So a survival situation is a scenario in which you have found yourself disoriented or further from the trailhead or vehicle than you anticipated. It could involve a medical emergency, although medical emergencies can create a number of different decision-making variables that are infinitely more subjective and complicated depending on your training. So ideally, you're not severely injured. So how do survival situations happen? Right? I think it's important to understand how survival situations happen so that we can avoid them. The simple answer is one, not having a plan, right? So just, and I'm a big fan of just going on wanders or, epic adventures. And so by no means am I saying that you have to meticulously plan everything. But what I mean by this is not having a plan in the event that you end up out there longer than you anticipated. That could include not telling somebody where you're going and when you're going to be back. Just in general, it's just a lack of preparedness. Over-reliance on other people, which sort of falls into that category. Just assuming somebody's going to be there to help you or, come down the trail, or a number of other ways you would rely on somebody else. Lack of knowledge about the ecosystem you're in. And this has more to do with awareness and paying attention to your surroundings, but it also has to do with safety and understanding seasonal temperatures, what seasonal weather patterns are like, right? If you're not from the coast, you might not realize that on a hot summer day, it could go from being very hot to very cold, and the only difference between those two is whether or not the fog comes in. Overconfidence in your untested skills, just assuming you're going to rise to the occasion. And, there's a saying that I was taught by a Navy SEAL, and that was, you don't rise to the occasion, you fall back on your training. And so I think a lot of folks just sort of assume like, well, if I got lost, I'd figure it out, and in some cases that's true, but I don't think that's the ultimate survival plan. By any means. So let's take a look at some survival statistics to kind of further understand, how survival situations happen and kind of what it looks like. So these I just pulled off of the internet. Information on survival statistics can be tricky to get because it's a number of different organizations that compile that data. So you could do your own research, although I'm fairly certain these numbers are accurate. So over 70% of search and rescue missions take place on land. So clearly we're talking about survival on land rather than in the ocean, but the rest of that would be the ocean. In Yosemite alone, there's over 200 search and rescue cases annually, which that's a pretty big number. A quick Google search revealed that roughly 14,000 people are lost in the woods a year, which I just Googled, how many people get lost in the woods a year, but it's pretty interesting, right? It's quite a few folks, probably more than that. The number one cause of death when people do get lost is exposure. There are other causes of death, like falling and drowning, though exposure is relevant to this discussion because we have a certain amount of control over that. Unplanned medical emergencies account for the most fatalities in wilderness areas, and so it's actually not people getting lost and dying. It's medical emergencies. Most survival situations or lost person situations average between 12 to 72 hours to the point of when they're reported missing and to the point that they're rescued. And that's very important because that's going to allow us to prioritize our biological needs in an order that makes sense. Lastly, heavily traveled parks, or like basically areas that are well recreated, that are relatively close to high population densities, actually account for most of lost person situations rather than remote areas. And my theory for that is that there's actually a barrier to entry when it comes to going into remote places. And so someone's not just going to wake up one morning and charter a bush plane and get dropped on the north slope of the Brooks Range in Alaska. If you were to get dropped out there, you would certainly be experienced and have a plan. And I really don't think you'd even be able to hire a pilot to drop you out there unless that pilot was confident that you'd be alive when they returned. So my point is just it can happen close to home. So how can we stay safe and still have fun? I'm a huge advocate for going on wild adventures. And so I like to teach folks about survival in a way that doesn't scare them. So hopefully I don't do that here with this presentation. So how can we stay safe and still have fun? Or how can we be prepared would be another way of kind of phrasing this. And this is where I like to introduce the mom mentality. And that's why we've got this great photo that Mark found of a mom, providing some snacks there, which are critical, right? We'll get into that. So the mom mentality is pretty straightforward. And it's something, I call it the mom mentality, but you could also call it the dad mentality or the parent mentality. But it's very evident. It was evident in my mom, and I do see it in mothers. And what it is it's planning for or addressing potential scenarios before they happen and then being prepared for those. And so whereas a mom in this case might be, concerned about somebody, soiling their pants, we're not going to be necessarily, hopefully you're not going to have to prepare for that, but, with your adult friends. But the mom mentality could include, checking the weather, learning about potential hazards, just not assuming that that 6 mile hike is going to go super smooth. Maybe assuming that even though the trail says it's 6 miles, maybe plan for it to be 10, right? Always plan to be out longer than you expected. But basically the mom mentality is having your biological needs. So having snacks, having extra clothes, looking at the weather, carrying plenty of water, all of those things are the mom mentality. And it's just this, in my opinion, it's the ultimate preparedness mentality, which isn't necessarily like the hardcore macho survival mentality a lot of people think of. But I believe it's the best. So the mom mentality sort of includes preparedness to an extent. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about survival kits. Survival kits are kind of a hotly debated topic. And so I'm just going to be giving you my experience and opinion on survival kits. Yes, I do believe you should carry gear with you, but I believe you should carry gear with you that you know how to use and that you're familiar with. Most survival kits that are sold commercially are heavy, and in my experience, borderline useless in an emergency, particularly if you don't spend a lot of time learning to use the contents of your kit. For example, a bunch of snare wire and some fish hooks and like some cool metal card that you can pop more fish hooks and like a bottle opener out of. You know, that's not going to do you much good if you're shivering and you need to make a shelter. When you do design your kit, you should consider what we're going to be covering in this presentation. So consider your biological survival needs and keep it simple, right? Make sure you're very capable of using all of the items you have in your kit. And in my opinion, for example, if you're going to carry an ignition source for lighting fire, it should be carried in conjunction with accelerant. And you should have 100% confidence that you could use that blindfolded in the dark during a torrential downpour and not have any sort of questions or wondering what you're going to do. You should have done it before so that when you pull it out, it's like something, it's like an old friend and you know exactly what to do. And again, this ties a little bit back into my overlying or underlying philosophy, which is gear is great, but knowledge is better. The more you know, the less you need. The more you know, the less you need, but also the better you'll be able to use the items you do have, which I think is the important part. It's not that you should be, carrying nothing, assuming you'll be able to just rub some sticks together to make fire. What I mean by that is that if you don't know how to use the items in the first place, what good are they going to do you? They're just dead weight in your backpack. So we're going to get into survival here a little bit, right? So we're going to start with survival psychology. And the most important thing you need to understand about survival is that it is mostly psychological. And if we were to look at a number of different survival situations and we were to pick one key feature of survivors, right, folks that survived, it would be positive mental attitude. And I know it sounds cliche, but it is extremely important, and I'm going to explain why. So why is staying calm so important? Our nervous system is vital in regulating nearly every aspect of our well-being. To perform at our best, we must stay calm. It's always in your best interest to stay calm. So there are basically two nervous system responses. There's the parasympathetic nervous system response and the sympathetic nervous system response. Your parasympathetic nervous system response is hopefully the state that you're in now. It is calm yet alert. You're able to prioritize tasks logically and make complicated layered decisions relatively easily. This might include, as an example, do I stay on this trail or do I leave the trail and bushwhack because I think my vehicle is 700 yards to my right? Also, under the operating system of your parasympathetic nervous system, metabolically, your body's actually burning fuel very efficiently. So you're not wasting calories or water, which will kind of tie back in here later. Now, your sympathetic nervous system response is the one that we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about. And that's your fight or flight response. So there's a lot of information here, but your sympathetic nervous system directs the body's rapid involuntary response to dangerous or stressful situations. A flash flood of hormones boosts the body's alertness and heart rate, sending extra blood to the muscles. And why does that matter or relevant for survival? When you panic, you're limiting yourself to gross motor movements and yes or no decisions. And so science has proven that. If you let panic take over, or your sympathetic nervous response, or your fight or flight response, whatever language you want to use for that, you're no longer capable of utilizing fine motor skills, and you are no longer capable of utilizing, or being able to make complex decisions, which when you look at them aren't that complex, right? Like just a yes or no decision could be a little bit overwhelming if you did panic, and you're really limiting yourself if you panic. And again, this saying kind of resonates here. It's we don't rise to the occasion, we fall back on our training. And that's directly talking about staying calm, because basically what it's saying is rising to the occasion would be learning new things and just sort of being at your best, right? And we don't want to assume we're going to be in that state. We want to assume that we're going to be at our worst to an extent, right? And so we want to be able to procure our basic biological needs, or whatever it might look like in a survival situation. So for example, get a fire going, or build a shelter, or, think through, wow, should I hike back to my car? Did I come this way, or did I come that way? Those are all decisions and skills that will become significantly more challenging to use if you allow yourself to panic. So I sort of summarized that already, but let's just go over it. So when you panic, you lose the ability to use the skills that you need most. You're likely going to make rash decisions that you might not even realize you ever made. This is a phenomenon that takes place relatively often. One example is a couple years ago, there was a couple that got lost in Point Reyes National Seashore, and they ended up really far off trail. And this isn't just them. This happens a lot. And the only way that I can explain why someone would leave the trail is panicking, potentially blacking out, or making decisions that they don't realize they're making. And in that case, they had to be hoisted out by, I believe, Sonoma Fire Department, because it was so steep and so thick that even like the ground crews couldn't get them out of there. Also, when you panic, you're going to be burning excess calories that you're really going to need later. And I'm going to end up explaining that, but essentially conservation of energy is like the cornerstone upon which all of survival skills are laid upon. And so everything you do, you need to think about conservation of energy. And when you panic, you are not conserving energy. We'll say that. And also when you panic, you really begin to lack awareness to an extent. So although you might feel really aware, you might be flustered and maybe not paying attention. And as for example, you could roll your ankle or accidentally step on a rattlesnake, or, just be in that flustered state of like, I'm just trying to get out. And sometimes I think what an analogy that would resonate with y'all would be like when you're driving and you're worried you're going to be late, and you're driving really fast. Like, do you really get there that much faster? Usually not. It's usually just a lot more dangerous. So what are some strategies we can use to stay calm? One, take a deep breath. I know it sounds cliche, but it's true. Breathe. Two, take inventory. We're going to talk about this when we introduce STOP as an acronym, but taking inventory would, for example, look like, am I injured? Hopefully it's no. Am I in a place that I recognize? Hopefully it's yes. What do I have in my backpack? Am I thirsty? Should I drink some water? When's the last time I ate? That would include taking, all of those would be included in taking inventory. Utilizing a mantra could be very valuable. So mine is shelter, water, fire, and food, which will make sense here shortly. And then you could also just remind yourself, hey, I watched Jack's presentation, so I'm just inconveniently camping, right? That would be the ultimate way to stay calm, hopefully. So navigation, right? It's fairly important when we talk about survival. And I think that it's also important in just like loss proofing yourself. Loss proofing is a term that we use in reference to using sort of intuitive navigational skills and basic preparedness, including the mom mentality, to just reduce the odds of you getting lost. And so land navigation skills are great, but they're not essential to navigate successfully. Indigenous peoples, specifically, as an example, Aboriginal culture of Australia used a technique called songlining, which we'll address here later, to navigate, which doesn't include declinating or using an azimuth or all that stuff. A map and compass is great if you can use them and you know where you are. It doesn't really do you a whole lot of good to whip out a map and a compass if you really have no clue where you're at. And it also doesn't do you much good to carry those items if you don't know how to use them. There's a lot of wonderful classes out there that teach you map and compass skills and basic land nav, and I highly recommend them. I know REI offers some. I currently do not teach any, but perhaps will in the future, and certainly would if somebody was interested. Terrain association, in my opinion, is something that intuitively everybody can do and learn quickly, and intuitively something that everybody knows is what I meant to say there, and something everybody's capable of doing. And what terrain association is, really simplified, is using landmarks to walk in a straight line. So some of you might not be familiar with the term lateral drift, but if we were to set everybody up in a line on a fire road, right? And then there's a bunch of brush, and then say 700 yards, there's another fire road paralleling that road. And we were to set up, all of you on that road, maybe 30 feet apart from each other, and say, okay, I'll meet you on that other road, just walk in a straight line. I could almost guarantee that if you didn't know it was a land navigation exercise, almost nobody would make it to that road. And so the reason for that would be lateral drift. Lateral drift is essentially walking in circles because one of your legs is either longer than the other, or one of your stride lengths between your left and your right side is slightly longer or shorter than the other. And when one of your stride lengths or legs is longer or shorter, if you're not paying attention, what's going to happen? You're going to walk off in a circle. And this is a phenomenon that happens regularly in lost persons cases. And there's some incredible stories about lateral drift and people just being lost and walking in circles for weeks. So back to songlining. What songlining is essentially is using your awe and appreciation for the landscape to navigate. And in songlining in Aboriginal culture, as far as I understand it, was basically using songs to create mental maps. So these songs would describe land features, right? And then at a certain age, that person may go out onto the landscape, and that song that they were taught for maybe water or good hunting grounds, they would sing that song, and that song would guide them through the land features to get to that place and then back. And so from a practical perspective, songlining for you might look like, while you're walking along, just looking at the landscape around you and going, wow, that's a really cool redwood stump right there. Look at that springboard cut out of that redwood stump, or look at that big cavity in there. And then you notice that, kind of put it in your brain. You look at it as you walk by, so you get a little image of what it looks like from behind you. And then all of a sudden you notice another, like, wow, look at that big rock right off to the side of the trail. It kind of looks like a face, right? And you just keep going. And then say you're trying to get back and it's getting dark and you're not sure if you were on that trail or not. And then you see the rock and you're like, oh, yes, I saw that rock. I remember that rock. Okay, now I'm going to look for the tree. Then you see the tree. Then you can continue to use that as essentially terrain association on a small scale. Hopefully that makes sense. So you get lost. What do you do now? It's hard for me to tell you exactly what to do because survival situations are so dynamic. And there's an infinite number of variables and everybody is different. So make this and everything that I'm saying here, turn it into your own, right? Nature isn't rigid. It's very fluid. And I think it's important that as the animals that we are, that we also be fluid and adapt. So you get lost. One, stay calm. Everybody understands why. If you freak out, you're just going to make bad decisions. You're going to burn a bunch of extra calories that you're going to need to stay warm that night. You're probably going to dehydrate yourself just spazzing out and running around. So stay calm and stay put, right? So STOP as an acronym. That means stop, think, plan, and observe. So stop means sit down, don't panic, and stay where you are. Search and rescue always recommends staying put. That's the official recommended advice from basically all emergency personnel, unless you're unsafe. But or you're in a scenario where you can't stop. But if you can, you're going to stop. Sit down, take a deep breath, stay put. T stands for think, right? So what do you know about your situation and location? Again, The United States Forest Service recommends that you don't move at all until you have a specific reason to move. And I think that is really telling that they even have that quote and statement on their website. O stands for observe, right? So look around, gather information that can help you figure out where you are and orient yourself. Do you have a map and compass so you can, do you know where you are? Can you use the map and compass? Are there signs labeling the trail intersections? Like just slow down and look around you, right? And observe could also include, are there potential hazards, right? Is there a big old black bear huffing at me in the bushes? Not that should be a frightening experience, but if you're whatever, is there boulders flying down the hill? Is there an avalanche you have to move there? It's just observe your current situation and address that and take action on what you need to do. And sometimes taking action just means a lack of action and just sitting down. And then P stands for plan. So at this point, you'd kind of walk through it in your head. Again, you're going to be able to do this better if you're calm. And so you just consider possible courses of action and you choose one. Maybe you continue hiking down the path in the dark because you have a headlamp and you're recognizing terrain features. Or you turn around and backtrack, right? Depending on the situation you're in. And if you're injured and it's becoming dark, then it's probably best to stay put and build a shelter. So this question comes up fairly often, and this is, should I signal for rescue? And this kind of ties into that previous slide of like, okay, I'm staying put. Are someone going to come find me? Do I signal for rescue? Signaling for rescue is a pretty big discussion, but some of the most important kind of opinions of mine to share would be that without knowing where you are or utilizing an emergency beacon, you're either just sitting there waiting for someone to come along to help you, or you're going out and looking for people. And I always recommend waiting, but searching out help, as an example, could be following water, right? So a lot of people know that, and if you don't now, you will, that small water leads to bigger water and bigger water leads to people. So where we live, hiking down into a low point, locating a creek, following that creek downstream, maybe it leads into a larger creek or a river, and then following that is likely going to lead you to safety. Now, there's also an enormous risk in making that decision, so it's really case-by-case basis. The risk would be burning excess calories and getting significantly more lost, but hopefully that makes sense for you. An emergency beacon we'll talk about, but in my opinion, emergency beacons are excellent survival tools. It is a piece of technology, and I'm not a huge fan of relying on technology, but an emergency beacon is basically a GPS in which you hit a button and search and rescue comes to that point. So staying put is always recommended if possible. And your considerations in that case should be, will anyone come looking for me? And can I safely stay here? And we covered that, and there is going to be some redundancy in this presentation, and it's intentional because it's important. And so as far as signaling goes, signaling has been used successfully, though in most of the Bay Area, if you stay on the trail and stay put, somebody's going to come along. Now, in remote places where there's a lot of aircraft flying over, say Alaska or certain parts of Canada, signaling for rescue could be a viable strategy, though there are a lot of considerations there, like how are you going to signal for rescue? Is it going to be visible from the sky? All of those details. In my opinion, in the Bay Area, signaling for rescue is a waste of valuable physical and mental energy, unless you're in a case where you're trained to do so. You've taken a course on how to signal for rescue and you have the adequate tools like a signal mirror and you know how to use it. Otherwise, I think carrying an emergency beacon is really the best way to be prepared, rather than a signal mirror, because that emergency beacon's guaranteed to get you out for the most part. Signal mirror really isn't, because there's plenty of teens that are flashing airplanes with signal mirrors. So to kind of summarize, should you signal for rescue or not? It's really on a case-by-case basis. And in most cases, fire is probably too dangerous to light. And though you may get rescued, you might also start a forest fire. And just here where we live, or where I live here in the Redwoods, there's often a really dense canopy and there's really not that much air traffic moving slowly and looking for me. Search and rescue is really good at their job. And if you stay on a trail, you have a much higher probability of getting rescued than by going off trail and signaling for rescue. So if there's any questions on anything we've already talked about, ask them in the chat and we'll make time for it. But what I'm here to talk about is survival. So we talked about avoidance, and if there's further questions on that, I'd love to field them. And what I would emphasize is that if you really embrace that mom mentality, preparedness, looking at the weather, addressing your biological needs like we're going to talk about here, and kind of following the advice that I'm going to give you regarding survival, then I really don't think it's likely that you're going to end up in a survival situation. Some things to carry would be a light, right? Always have a headlamp and extra batteries. Never rely on your phone, or some type of flashlight. An emergency beacon would be ideal. A lighter and matches, or a lighter and accelerant, whatever you use best to start fire. A knife, adequate clothing, which we're going to talk about, plenty of water, and lots of snacks. If you carry all of those things and you tell someone where you're going and when you're going to be back, very low probability you're going to end up as a statistic. So let's talk about survival skills. Here, I'll go back. This is a picture of me in a shelter that I was sleeping in over one summer. This wasn't a survival situation, but I just love survival and living in the woods. And so anyways, it was a great shelter. It's still standing, and I had some wonderful nights in that shelter. And no, I didn't have a fire in it because it would be a serious fire hazard. So some nights the mosquitoes were pretty bad in the summertime. So as far as survival skills go, I'm going to teach you guys what I teach search and rescue, and I teach all other folks. And I like to teach foundational skills because nature is infinitely dynamic. So we're going to focus on skills that can be applied to a wide variety of different situations. I'm not going to assume that you're in the Bay Area. So I'm going to be teaching with the assumption that you could use this stuff anywhere. So we're going to be talking about our biological needs, right? And we're going to get into that more in depth. I do think it's important to touch on this concept of risk versus reward. Risk versus reward is extremely important. And what risk versus reward is it's a filter that you put all of your decisions through prior to making them. And so you always have to ask yourself, what is the associated risk with this decision? And what is the associated reward? So an example would be, do I stay on the trail or do I hike up this really steep mountain to try and find light pollution and hike in that direction? Well, the risk associated with staying on the trail would be if you didn't build a shelter, you might be cold and doing jumping jacks and push-ups all night to stay warm, get really tired. The reward is someone might come along early in the morning jogging and you might get rescued. The risk associated with hiking up that hill is there is no light pollution. You burn a ton of energy and water, and you won't even be able to keep yourself warm because you're so exhausted, right? And so the reward would be light pollution, and now you have a really long hike ahead of you. I don't know if I could decide which one for you, but I would highly recommend you stay put. Conservation of energy is another form of risk versus reward. And the best way to think of conservation of energy is like a financial investment, right? And so in survival, you only have the calories in water, or calories specifically, you really only have the ones that are in your backpack, right? And the water that's in your bottle, at least initially. And so that becomes very valuable because it's a resource that can be challenging to replenish. And so that financial analogy is just that if you're going to undertake any type of decision making or action, you just got to consider, am I going to get returns from this? Because you're going to be putting in calories and water, either constructing a shelter, hiking out, building a fire, whatever it might be. And you just have to ask yourself, if I make the decision to do this, is it going to benefit me? Or am I going to burn more calories than I'm even going to get back in return? And specifically that example that I just said there, as far as like burning more calories than you're going to get back in return, really applies to food. And we'll talk more so about that later in the presentation. But that mindset applies to everything. And so think of your calories and water as a precious resource that you cannot waste. Every step has to have intention behind it. And then positive mental attitude. We touched on that, but it's critical. You have to have a positive mental attitude. There are stories of people surviving medically impossible feats of survival, largely due to their positive mental attitude. And there's actually an awesome book written about that. It's called Deep Survival by Lawrence Gonzalez. I highly recommend it. So, what are our biological survival needs? I call these the big four. Many refer to them as the sacred order. Now, these are our biological survival needs in the order in which they're prioritized. And so they go like this: air, shelter, water, fire, food, other humans, and tools. Though the ones that we're going to be focusing on there are shelter, water, fire, and food. And that is the order in which we prioritize them. And this is why. The rule of threes. The rule of threes is something that I think the military came up with a long time ago when they were developing their SEER training program. But the rule of threes is essentially how long you can survive without your biological survival needs, right? And so on average, most people can go 3 minutes without air, 3 hours without shelter, 3 days without water, and 3 weeks without food, and then 3 years without human interaction. And those are just averages, right? So don't get too hung up on like, oh, I've been out here for 2 hours and 45 minutes. I got 15 minutes before I die without shelter. No, that's not how it works. It's a way that we can prioritize our needs to create a list. And what does making a list do? It allows us to be very efficient and still be able to get what we need to get done. So before we dive very deep into shelter, I think it's important to talk about our first layer of defense, which is our clothing. And so clothing is a pretty, we could probably do an entire presentation on clothing just on its own, but there's a lot of incredible clothing out there. So let's talk about it. Clothing is your first layer of defense. And I would highly recommend avoiding cotton and using fabrics that are more conducive to your outdoor needs, because it could be enough to avert a survival situation altogether. And so why should we avoid cotton? Cotton is considered hydrophilic, meaning it is more attracted to being wet than dry. It's very attracted to moisture. When cotton gets wet, it loses all of its insulation value, and it is very challenging to dry out once it's wet. I would also add that in wet environments, it is quite challenging to keep dry. And cotton has been kind of nicknamed death cloth by Yosemite Search and Rescue. And they deemed it, they gave it that name because they were finding a lot of folks that were, lost and dead wearing cotton. So as far as what you should wear, right? We have two, I differentiate, there's a lot of options, but I like to break them into 2 categories, right? And so those 2 categories are wool and synthetic. Wool is sort of like the tried and true tested outdoor clothing, right? If you look at, old military fatigues or folks that live in very wet and cold climates, wool is what they wear, right? And it's what's been worn since the beginning of time. Wool is naturally antimicrobial. It insulates very well when wet. Some say it retains up to 80% of its insulation value, but I think that's a hard statistic to quantify because it's really based on the, the weave, the specific type of wool. There's a lot of variables there. It is flame retardant. And the downside to it is that it can be itchy if it's low quality, and it's heavy weight-wise. But overall, wool, if I had to choose, wool would be what I would wear. I've worn like a merino wool t-shirt in the backcountry for 18 days straight, and it didn't get stinky at all, which is pretty impressive. Synthetic, on the other hand, is just as good at insulating, and it dries out significantly faster than wool. And so for very active outdoor folks, synthetic might be your clothing of choice for your outerwear or your sort of mixed garments that aren't next to skin. The problem with synthetic is it can get very stinky. It will melt if it's exposed to fire. But again, the benefits are it dries out very quickly and it will insulate you very well when wet, probably just as well as wool. It's sort of personal preference. I prefer wool, but I do utilize both. Now, regardless of the type of clothing you're wearing, layering is critical, right? And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but it's important to mention. When most people get lost, or not get lost, but when most people develop severe cases of hypothermia, oftentimes it's not due to foul weather. Their clothing gets wet from their sweat or perspiration. And so I think all of us have probably started a hike where we're all bundled up because it's super cold. And then all of a sudden we're hiking 10 minutes later, we're like, oh, I got to take my jacket off. You stop, you put your jacket away, keep going. Oh man, I'm sweating. I got to take my next layer off. You keep going, right? And that's why you layer. You layer so that you can thermoregulate very efficiently to avoid perspiration. Because when you perspire, you wet out your layers from the inside out. Once those layers get wet, if they don't insulate well when wet, for example, cotton, then when you get to the top of that mountain peak and it's time to turn around, right? You get up to the top, you're taking in the views, you eat a little snack, you're sitting up there, it's a little breezy, you're not expending energy, creating metabolic heat, and all of a sudden you start getting cold. And if you didn't layer correctly, that sweatshirt you're wearing might be soaked with sweat. So it's not insulating you. Now all of a sudden you're going downhill on the way back and you begin to shiver, and then all of a sudden you're hypothermic, and that's how the story goes. So oftentimes when people do develop hypothermia, many times it's due to physical exertion and not wearing the correct clothing. So layering is extremely important, and I know I'm layering right now. I have my vest on. Underneath my vest, I've got my fleece. Underneath that, I've got my t-shirt. But I'm a huge advocate of layering, and I think everybody should do that. Being an outdoor or being a survival instructor and an outdoor guide, I get to see a lot of folks in the clothing they choose to wear. And even this week, one of my students was wearing like a full cotton sweatpants and hoodie and Vans and cotton socks, pretty much the worst possible clothes you could wear. And fortunately for him, he stayed dry. But I get to see how many folks are wearing cotton. And when you're going hiking, I just can't stress this enough. You should treat your clothing like it's your first line of defense. And we put all this money and investment and time into our backpacks and our gear, but we need to put just as much time and resources into our clothing system. I believe that you should design a clothing system that will keep you safe and keep you dry. And like I said in the beginning of the clothing segment here, you could avert a survival situation altogether by just wearing the right gear. So building a system rather than just wearing what looks good is extremely important. And a system is a complicated word for just saying layer, but what a clothing system or an 8-piece system could look like is, you've got your rain gear, which could also be a layer to block wind or convective heat loss, which we're going to discuss here shortly. You've got your puffy layer, right? A puffy jacket is one of those things that, in my opinion, it's an essential gear item. Because you could fall into a river, and if that thing's dry in your backpack, you'd throw it on, and just start hiking, and your body heat's going to actually dry your clothes out from the inside out if you're wearing a good insulating layer. So it could be a puffy. Then you have an insulating layer beneath that. You have your base layer. You have your pants. You have your pants. Then you have your base layer. And you got your, including your socks and all that stuff. So I don't know if that adds up to 8, but an 8-piece system is just a common terminology thrown around in the outdoor clothing company world. And I think, you could also just go to the Goodwill and you could shop for secondhand items that are used, and you could totally deck yourself out in an incredible clothing system by just going to the Goodwill and picking up secondhand items. You don't always have to buy brand new stuff. Although, you know, it's a good idea to take clothing seriously. And there's a reason that a lot of outdoor clothing is like super colorful. And the reason for that is high vis, right? So if you get lost, you're easy to see. Whereas like for me, I'm trying to blend in. I'm trying to not be seen most times, ideally. And so I end up buying clothing from kind of hunting companies and outdoor companies and stuff like that make some incredible high performance technological outdoor clothing. So if you have questions on clothing, feel free to ask. But to summarize it, wool socks, wool base layers, either synthetic or wool insulating layers, synthetic pants, and a puffy jacket and a raincoat. You should always have that with you. Even if you get soaked, you can still survive using what's known as a dynamic rewarming drill, which is basically taking off all your layers, wringing out all the moisture, putting your wet layers back on, and you just keep moving. The dynamic rewarming drill, you need to have calories, so you got to have snacks. If you can heat up water and drink warm liquids, that's important. But you can literally Google or on YouTube, you can look up a dynamic rewarming drill, and you can see folks like breaking ice and jumping in a frozen river and then throwing on all their layers and post holing through the snow in Montana and super cold weather. And 45 minutes to an hour later, they're completely dry. So there's value in having a good clothing system. So let's get into shelter outside of clothing, right? And so when we're talking about shelter, there's a strong misconception that like a shelter is like a wiki up or a teepee or some large structure that you're hanging out in and you're whittling and you got your fire going and you're cooking your food, right? Like that's what some people think of when they think of shelter. And that is a form of shelter, but the shelters that we're talking about are body heated structures, right? And so with these structures, the mantra is the more space your body has to heat, the more energy you're going to burn heating it. So it's critical that it's small and that you have lots of insulation. And so there's two main heat loss mechanisms when it comes to building shelter. And those two are conduction and convection. And so conductive heat loss is taking place typically through the ground or any solid surface. And conduction is just where, you're on a hike and you sit down on the ground to drink some water or have a snack and your butt gets cold, right? If you're on a rock or you're on the bare earth. And that's conductive heat loss. The earth is pulling the heat out of your body in an attempt to warm either that whole rock or the entire planet to 98.6 degrees, which I hate to break to everybody, but it's not going to happen, right? It'd be like if you jumped in a pool and you're like, oh, it's a little chilly, but I'm just going to lay in here to warm it up. Like it's not a great strategy to heat up a large body of water. In some cases, it's not going to work at all, probably most. So conductive heat loss takes place through the ground. You never sleep on the bare ground. That's why you always have a sleeping pad with you if you're camping. A sleeping pad is a lot more than just comfort. It insulates you from the earth. And that's why for so many years, they were just like foam pads that frankly weren't very comfortable, but they kept you warm. And I'm sure some of you have probably had your sleeping pad either pop or maybe you forgot one or you had to loan it to somebody who forgot one and you slept on the ground in your sleeping bag. And I'm sure you know I'm sure I know how that night went, and it was probably pretty cold. I know I've made that mistake myself, and I continue to make it every once in a while. So conductive heat loss, you got to be insulated from the ground. Convective heat loss is what we know as either wind chill or just, the air pulling the heat off of you. And basically you got to have insulation around you and you got to have insulation beneath you. And insulation is by definition, any material that has a low weight to volume ratio. So it's really any material that has a lot of dead airspace in it. It's material that is fluffy. It's material that traps air against your body. And in this case, that's me as a little kid. And that's a shelter, one of my many that I built and slept in. That was on the East Coast. It was a super cold night. And it worked great. And so insulation is just a bunch of debris. It doesn't matter if it's wet. It doesn't matter if it's dry. At least, you're still going to use it, right? That's all you have. And even if it's green, that's all you have. And what's happening with insulation is there's dead airspace in the material, and that's trapping air against your body. So it's critical that you collect a lot of it, and that's how you combat conduction and convective heat loss. You just surround yourself in debris. So here's a great example of one of the best emergency survival shelters one could create. And this is a student of mine, Colin, and he's smiling, probably laughing, because he's about to spend a night in this pile of leaves. And so he's got debris beneath him and he's got debris over him. And we call this a Sasquatch sleeping bag. It's the most simple shelter you could create. And in my mind, it's the most practical survival shelter if you're not going to practice. And the reason it's so practical is every one of you could make a pile of debris if your life depended on it. We're all capable of doing that, right? And if there is no debris, then you would have to take, extra measures. And so what that could look like, say you're in the high country and it's like mostly granite, there's some rabbit brush, maybe some grass, but you're not down at tree line where the pines are. You got two options, right? One is move, get to the debris. Two would be, I can't move, I'm stuck. So what you would do is you'd think, okay, I have to fight conduction and I have to fight convection. What that would look like in that situation would be ripping up as much material as you can, or finding material in your backpack or whatever you can improvise to get off the ground. Even if it's just like 2 inches of material, whatever you have to insulate you from the ground, even if it's just the tiniest little pile that you can barely fit on curled up into a ball, that's better than nothing. So you get out of the wind, right? So you find a rock or a little dip. You get your pile of debris down there, your little pile. Maybe you have a sleeping pad or something, but you get your pile down there, and then you do a bunch of jumping jacks, get your metabolic engine going, warm yourself up. And then what you do is you curl up into the fetal position, ideally with all your layers on, and you just lay there until you get cold. You lay on your pile. The reason you curl up into the fetal position is when you curl up into the fetal position, you retain 70% of your heat loss. It's not a comfortable way to sleep, but if you're trying to stay alive, you're trying to stay alive. So you curl up into a ball and you lay on that little pile of debris you created. And when you start noticing that you're getting cold, before you start shivering, you get up and you do more jumping jacks or push-ups or squats or whatever you can do to stay warm, jogging in place. And then you get back down and you curl up into a ball. And that might be a long night, but I can guarantee you're going to make it. So this is a Sasquatch sleeping bag. It's a giant pile of debris. And yes, his head and neck and arms are exposed for this photo. But he was in the process of actually pulling this debris over his entire body, including most of his face. Insulation breathes, so we're not worried about suffocation or anything like that. And if you can, you do have to cover up most of your face. You can leave your face exposed, but your head and neck must be covered up. Otherwise, you're going to lose a bunch of body heat through your head and neck if it's not insulated. So if you get lost, make the biggest pile of debris you can and crawl inside of it. If it's only 2 feet, then it's only 2 feet. If it's 8 feet, you're going to be very warm. I know I had students this last week in the high, it was like the high 20s in the morning, Fahrenheit, hailing, raining, everything was wet. And they were sleeping in piles that were like roughly, I don't know, maybe almost 4 feet. The two that slept in piles. And they were fine. So let's talk about debris shelter. The debris shelter is just a slightly more elaborate version of the Sasquatch sleeping bag. And this is a photo of me explaining this structure here to some students. The debris shelter is also a few slides back here. It's what you saw me posing in front of as a kid. I actually slept in debris shelters on and off for like 2 years as a teenager. I was just so obsessed with being outside. Still am. And I still spend many nights a year sleeping in debris huts, although most of them are for work with students. But I think it's critical that people get the opportunity to build and sleep in these emergency shelters, because it's really hard to know exactly what you have to create, and it creates muscle memory, right? So you can, if you really want to know this stuff so you can reproduce it, then you got to go out there and do it. There's no way of like knowing survival without actually practicing survival. And that goes for preparedness, it goes for navigation, it goes for everything. We're very used to reading or listening to information, but information is good, but you have to put it to use, especially with survival. It's the same thing with wilderness medicine. So this is a debris shelter, and this is a frame, right? And so a debris shelter, and how it differs from a Sasquatch sleeping bag, is it is a pile of debris that actually has a sleeping cavity inside of it. And that sleeping cavity is stuffed and covered with debris. You crawl in feet first, and you actually pull a plug of debris in behind you. And if you didn't know any better, you'd be a little bit concerned about oxygen in there, but the debris breathes so well that, you know, we need feet of it just to keep us warm. So you build a frame that you can fit inside of. You know, improvisation is very important in resourcefulness. So maybe you find a hollowed out redwood tree, maybe you find a stump you can lean some sticks up against. But the idea is you're just building a cavity that you can fit inside of. You're stuffing that with debris, and you're covering that with debris, crawling inside of it, and eventually plugging it with debris. Again, I want to emphasize that these are body heated structures, right? So in this photo, you can see there's some air holes around the entrance. So and this shelter is quite a bit larger than the student that's inside of it. The more space your body has to heat, the more energy you're going to burn heating it. The debris shelter gets a really bad rap in survival because folks built them incorrectly, spent one cold night, and then wrote them off. I can tell you right now that learning to build a debris shelter is a much more valuable life-saving skill than, like, you know, pitching a tarp or something like that. Because the tarp's not going to insulate you. The debris shelter will, as it will also shed water. And even if it's soaking wet, you can build these things and they'll keep you warm. When I was a teenager, I remember going on a survival trip. I think I was like 14, into northern Vermont, maybe Maine. And this was in like late November, in between Thanksgiving and Christmas. And we were building our shelters with like partially frozen. There was like snow and sleet when we were hiking in, and we were building shelters out of like partially frozen debris. And they, you know, it was pretty cold that first night, to be honest with you. I wasn't particularly happy that I was freezing my butt off in a wet pile of frozen leaves. But after one night in that shelter, we ended up spending a week out there. After one night in that shelter, my body heat had actually evaporated all of the moisture, and that shelter was significantly drier than anywhere else outside of it. So the mantra is, the more space your body has to heat, the more energy you're going to burn heating it. So it's really important that you really repeat that in your head. When you're building these shelters, I want you to think of them like a down sleeping bag, specifically a mummy bag, right? So a really tight fitting small structure, something that you can just barely squeeze into. And not that the frame is so tight, but you've stuffed it with so much debris that when you crawl in there, you're just jammed into a big pile of sticks and leaves, right? And essentially, this is biomimicry. So all animals build shelters, and this is just a human shelter. It's how we improvise shelter and learn from the rats and the squirrels and the birds and all of the animals that make these elaborate nests. You know, I spend a lot of time with wild pigs, and believe it or not, on really cold nights, wild pigs actually build nests as well. And so they tear up a bunch of debris and they root it all up into a pile, and they all bundle up and curl up together. And they sleep basically on top of each other in a pig pile, which is a real thing, in their little nest. We call them hog nests because they don't have much hair on them to insulate them, right? And so they actually insulate themselves from the ground. They typically build these nests in like little canyons, so they don't have much convective heat loss. And who knows, maybe the pigs are so smart that they're actually, you know, it's a survival strategy, and they're actually going, oh, we got to fight conduction and convection. Not really, but you get my point. This is a photograph of a student of mine. This was the day after he slept in this shelter with no other insulation than his blue jeans and cotton t-shirt. And his shelter worked excellent. From what I remember, several of my students on this particular trip built incredible shelters. And it did get cold that night. This was in November in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So they work. You just have to put some time and energy into looking for materials and learning how to build them. Um, when I'm teaching people how to build them, what I recommend is you choose a good location. So what you're looking for in a location is somewhere high and dry with lots of materials. I always recommend that you lay down in your spot before you build. Because, what if you lay down and there's an ant's nest or a bee's nest or some big old rock poking into your back? Like, yes, we're just talking about staying alive here. So being uncomfortable is sometimes a part of survival, particularly being comfortable at being uncomfortable. But you shouldn't be seeking out discomfort, and you should be choosing comfort when you can and when it's practical. And so you lay down in your spot, make sure it's level. If it is on a slope, make sure your head is above your feet on that slope and oriented in such a way that you don't have your feet above your head. So you always want to sleep with your head on the uphill side of a slope. And then first step, after you've chosen your good location that's high and dry with lots of materials, you've laid down in your spot, you've made sure that when you do build your structure or your Sasquatch sleeping bag or your leaf pile, that your head is going to be oriented uphill. Your first step is collecting debris. Without debris, you have no shelter. So you always collect debris first. Once you have your debris pile, you can then assess that situation and decide whether or not you want to continue by building a frame or utilizing a natural pre-existing structure that you've chosen. So this is the entrance here, and that pile of debris in front of the entrance is pulled in behind you. The entrance is oriented on the head side of the shelter, so you enter it feet first and roll onto your side, and you actually just pull that debris in and plug that entrance as best you can. Backpacks can work great for that, but it's very important that the debris shelter is stuffed, covered, and plugged with a significant amount of debris. I always tell people, if you poke your head in, like at our classes, we're building them during the daytime. If you poke your head in and you go, oh, I'm seeing light coming through, that's usually an indication that you're going to freeze your butt off and you need a lot more debris. If light's coming through, there's air coming through. So pick your spot, collect tons of materials, and then decide whether or not you want to build your frame. I would recommend, if you don't take a class and sleep in one of these, just build that Sasquatch sleeping bag. In a true emergency, that could be done with living vegetation. It could be done with grass. It could be done with virtually anything. Resourcefulness is a big part of survival. And resourcefulness is just being okay with what you have, making the best with what you have. And so you kind of have to embody that along with a positive mental attitude and just have this party on mentality where you're like, all right, here I am. I'm building my shelter. And I think before we move on from shelter, I do think one important kind of detail to mention is I'm not assuming that you're going to start building your shelter at like 11 a.m. When I teach shelter, and what I've told you thus far is me assuming you're going to be constructing this in the dark. Because at what point are you going to decide that you need to spend the night? And for most people, that's going to be at or near dark. So always pay attention to your surroundings. And while you're hiking, play a little game in your head. Like one of the best exercises that I do for shelter and recommend is while you're on a hike, look for piles of materials, right? Just look for them, because it's not always legal or even ethical to be building structures on properties that other people utilize. You don't want to just leave all these huts all over the place. So it's best to practice them on private property if you can, or come to a class. But look for the materials and maybe scratch the ground a little bit if you see quite a bit of materials, and just kind of assess, like, well, could I make a pile right here? And how long would it take me? For me, it usually takes about 15 or 20 minutes to make an adequate pile of leaves to sleep in into freezing temperatures with good materials. That's in the redwoods. In country with a lot less debris, we could be looking at like an hour and a half to 2 hours. Some of you might be wondering, like, well, isn't that burning excess energy, Jack? Like, didn't you tell me to conserve energy? Yes, I did. But if you don't build a shelter, those valuable calories that you would be using to heat your shelter, they're just dissipating into nature. They're disappearing. They're not coming back. So unless you've got clothing and a sleeping bag and a sleeping pad to sleep on, then you don't have a choice. You have to build a shelter. The number one cause of death in outdoor recreation or lost person situations is exposure. And so that makes shelter even more important. So yeah, think about debris shelters, think about shelter, think about what you might have in your pack that you could improvise for shelter, and look at how animals build shelters, because oftentimes they're the masters and we're just trying our best to learn what they know. So let's see what we got next here. Water. Before I get into water, the last kind of summarize all of that again, it would be the mantra is the more space your body has to heat, the more energy you're going to burn heating it. You always have to be aware of conduction and convection, which means you insulate from the ground and you insulate from the air around you. Insulation, by definition, is any material that has a low weight to volume ratio. So, for example, debris, if you were to hold a certain amount of debris and you put that down and you hold a certain amount of sand and then you hold a certain amount of rocks and then you hold a certain amount of goose down, the lightest is going to be the best at insulating. The heavier it gets, the worse it's going to be at insulating. So wood, for example, depending on where it's at in different stages of rot or decomposition, can insulate. Although if it hasn't decomposed, it might not have much dead airspace, and so it might not insulate. So remember to look for debris. The more space your body has to heat, the more energy you're going to burn heating it. Whatever you can create, you should create. That's why I've kind of stayed away from exact numbers here, because we're just trying to do our best to stay alive. So be happy with what you can make happen. And I'm not saying like give up because you're lazy and you made 6 inches. What I mean by that is if you busted your butt to make, a 4-foot pile of debris to crawl inside of and curl up into a ball in, then that's what you got. And there's no point thinking about, that you needed 2.5 more feet or whatever it might be. All debris is slightly different in insulation value. Redwood duff is a really good insulator, but grass can be great. Whatever you have, you use. But do be cognizant of where you decide to practice these, because in some places it's illegal. And if you do decide to practice them in a place where it is legal, be mindful of the fact that when you're done, to dismantle your shelter and make it disappear. Leaving shelters up, if you have permission to do so, is okay, but they can become inhabited by animals and or insects, which I'm sure some of you are wondering, like, well, what about the bugs and animals? Aren't they going to come after me in my shelter? And the answer is no. When you build a debris shelter, you're creating a massive disruption, and pretty much all insects are fleeing from that. Now, if you built your shelter in a deer bed in July, you're probably going to get covered in fleas. But ultimately, we're just trying to stay alive. And so as long as it's not a black widow or a brown recluse or, a bunch of yellow jackets that you're allergic to or whatever it is, then we're okay. But I haven't had a student get severely bitten in my decade plus of sleeping in these things, or a lifetime at this point, but decade plus of having people sleep in them. So if questions pop up on shelter, ask them. I'll answer them after. Let's get into water. So as far as water goes, shelter is more important in my opinion, but water is almost equally as important. Water is a pretty big subject, and I have a lot of information here to cover, so I'm kind of going to fire through it. But I'm going to do my best to emphasize what I believe are the most important elements of water. And so water is essential for thermoregulation and your metabolic processes. So you need to be hydrated. Dehydration and hypothermia love one another. They do. They lead to each other, and they truly do love one another. And I didn't talk much about hypo and hyperthermia, but I will discuss it a little bit here. And there it is: hypo and hypothermia and hyperthermia love dehydration. Hypothermia is cold exposure. Hyperthermia is heat. And the reason that the shelter that I discussed focused on cold is because in cold weather, it requires action. Okay, so If you stop and you just like lay there like you would in hot weather, your symptoms of hypothermia are going to get worse. Whereas in hot weather, it requires inaction. So we tell people to stop, stop all non-essential movement, get in the shade, hydrate if you can, and just stay calm. So dehydration can exacerbate fatigue, and this can kind of compound upon if you do panic, and can really create the perfect storm to result in you potentially severely injuring yourself or fatally injuring yourself on accident, by just spazzing out would be the least technical way of saying that. So it's very important that you stay hydrated. Even in cold weather, like this last week, I had to keep reminding my students, I know the water's freezing cold, but it's super important that you all drink it, because if you don't stay hydrated, you're going to be cold tonight, and I can guarantee it. So it's counterintuitive, but hydration is extremely important. So you got to stay hydrated so that your brain works well, your organs function well, and most importantly, your body can circulate heat and blood efficiently. When you become dehydrated, my assumption is that your blood would then become a little bit more viscous or thicker, and it would take your body more energy to circulate that blood, and maybe reaching a point where it's going to slow circulation down to extremities, thus increasing the chances of frostbite or being unable to physically use those extremities. So stay hydrated. It's super important. And in severe cases, dehydration can lead to people dying, particularly in hot weather. And I'm sure we all can think of one story or another down there in Southern California where somebody ended up going out, not having enough water, and ended up passing away due to dehydration. And it's not a way I would want to go, I'll tell you that. So always make sure you have plenty of water and that you're staying hydrated. What I tell people is I carry personally a minimum of a half gallon of water, and that's for a half day. Water's really heavy, so it's hard to carry a lot of it. But if I'm going into a place that's dry, I plan ahead and I'll either cache water along the trail, or I'll carry it on my back if I have to. And I have packed enough water for 5 days into remote high country areas for extended trips, where there was no water or maybe only snow available if it was melted. So you got to drink. I'm not going to tell you how much to drink, but I'll tell you how much your body loses bare minimum. So just relaxing, it's said that your body's going to lose 1 quart or liter of water. And that's just like you sleeping, chilling, listening to some music. That's not exerting energy at all. And I've heard you can lose up to 1 gallon an hour if you are exerting yourself. I do know heat stroke and dehydration are actually quite common here in the Bay Area, particularly in the summertime. So I would just recommend being really mindful of the fact that if you do end up lost out there and it's extremely hot and dry, whether or not you decided to bring water might be the difference between you surviving and not surviving. So always carry water. Worst case scenario, you have a heavy backpack and you get super strong legs or something like that. So what happens if you run out of water? Well, when your life is on the line, technically, there is no water that's too dirty for short-term survival. And I'm going to explain that right now before we talk about all the waterborne pathogens. We touched on earlier that most survival situations in North America last between 12 to 72 hours. And in most survival situations, before they're even deemed survival situations, so we'd say lost person situation, and within 3 hours of the person being reported missing. And so search and rescue is very good at their job. That being said, it's unlikely you're going to be out there for more than 72 hours or really more than a week. And all the reason we're afraid of drinking untreated water is what we're going to talk about here shortly, is because of waterborne pathogens, and they can make you sick, right? And the concern would be if you were to get sick, you would be unable to maintain adequate hydration orally. Like you would require antibiotics and IV hydration. Though in a true survival situation, I'm going to tell you, dehydration is more likely to kill you than any waterborne pathogen here where we are. And if it comes down to it and I'm lost in a super dry, hot environment and all I have is some funky looking puddle, I'm going to drink it, because then I'll be alive for when rescue comes. And then I can go get treated for whatever was in that water, which we'll talk about here shortly. So that gets into this next little talking point, which is dehydration can kill you 3 times faster than waterborne pathogen infections in North America. And so you shouldn't be, negligent in just like sampling random water sources. I mean, you could if you're okay with getting sick, but my point is just that we're more concerned that you're going to die of dehydration before we rescue you than we are that you're going to develop like a severe case of Giardia and get such severe diarrhea that you're not going to be able to maintain hydration. And we'll talk about why. Waterborne pathogens have an incubation period, meaning the point in which you've ingested them until the point you get sick. And that incubation period does not fall within 72 hours, like 90% of the time for most people. If it's hot or dry, your mantra should be stop all non-essential movement, get in the shade, stay put, stay calm, and ideally stay hydrated, but we're assuming you have no water, so it's just stop all non-essential movement, get in the shade, stay put, and stay calm. We'll talk about drinking your pee later, I promise. Always carry more water than you think you need. I already kind of touched on that, but I just want to remind everybody that without water, we can't survive. So it's extremely important. It allows your body to function. So this idea that like 12 ounces of water is adequate for a day hike is silly, and it's irresponsible. So everybody should have a big old water bottle that's always filled up to the brim every chance you get. And you should be drinking a bunch of water. So when you get lost, right, the question, or if you're hiking and you run out of water, the question is always like, well, can I drink from this creek? And we touched on most of this stuff, but in short-term survival, the goal is just to stay alive long enough to get rescued. And so, yes, we drink from that creek, but there are risks associated with drinking from that creek. And we're going to talk about mitigating those risks here later in this presentation. But what we're trying to avoid are common waterborne pathogens like protozoa, amoebic, and bacterial infections. Giardia is really the most likely one that is going to produce such severe symptoms that they would require hospitalization, though lots of cases of Giardia can resolve on their own as well. And as you'll learn, some folks are more prone to symptoms than others. And so ultimately, whether or not you can drink from that creek is based on the situation that you're in. Questions that would kind of go through my mind would be, first, what's the risk and what's the reward? So is the risk of not drinking this water going to lead me to becoming severely dehydrated or further dehydrated and result in me being, hallucinating or going crazy or just being extremely disoriented and dying? Or is the risk I'm going to get Giardia in a week to a month? Or feel sick in 2 weeks, right? And if you're still out there in 2 weeks, then you got other problems at that point. But most survival situations, like that couple I mentioned in Point Reyes, they just drank from a puddle they found, and that was one of the big reasons they stayed alive. Including another reason would be seasonally warm temperatures and the fact that they stayed off the ground and cuddled up at night. So if you find water, should you drink it? Should you not? Let's talk about it. So why don't you want to drink the water, right? Why, or why would you be hesitant, let's say, to drink that water? Mostly because of waterborne pathogens. In urban environments, there's a lot of other stuff here, but we're focusing on nature. So, there's not viruses and a bunch of horrible stuff floating around in the woods like there are, storm runoff outside of a city. So one of those big waterborne pathogens is Giardia. And I think everybody's familiar with Giardia, but let's just fire through what I have written here. Giardia is a microscopic protozoa parasite that causes inflammation of the intestinal tract. What's important to note here is that Giardia can affect individuals differently. It can be present in a water source, but isolated to one area, and then practically absent in other parts of that same body of water. So in the context of wilderness survival cases, Giardia is rarely diagnosed or reported. And there haven't been enough scientific studies to figure out just how common Giardia is in wilderness areas. Like I briefly mentioned earlier, some individuals can handle higher amounts of Giardia exposure without developing symptoms, while others contract it very easily. Symptoms can show between 48 hours to a month. And this was actually the only source I found that referenced 48 hours. The CDC, I believe, says 1 week to like a month. But most people I know that have contracted Giardia report symptoms like a week after they've drank water. So yeah, most describe symptoms developing after about 14 days of exposure, which is much longer than our 12 to 72 hour survival window. So that just sort of kind of explains why I recommend drinking water if you have no other options and you're severely dehydrated, that you might not drink if you had water. So some folks can actually be exposed to Giardia and never show symptoms, which is really interesting. And so it really comes down to you as an individual. And what's happening when you do ingest Giardia is the cysts colonize and reproduce in the small intestines. And this eventually leads to uncomfortable, but normally like non-life-threatening illnesses under normal backpacking conditions. That being said, in survival, those that like not being life-threatening under normal backpacking conditions can become life-threatening. So we do want to do our best to mitigate risk, and we're going to talk about that. We don't want to take unnecessary risk when we can avoid drinking contaminated water. But if you did develop Giardia in a survival situation, my concern would be that the dehydration would compound, leading to increased vulnerability of hypo or hyperthermia, and that you wouldn't be able to maintain adequate hydration orally to just keep your body to function. Or to allow your body to continue to function. So if you did contract Giardia, there's not a whole lot you can do, but anyways, this is Giardia. Let's look at some other waterborne pathogens. Out of all of these, I would say Giardia is the most dangerous and the one that I emphasize and spend the most time on. And there's no way to know whether a water source is infected, although I could tell you, I could tell you that Giardia is, in all waterborne pathogens, but Giardia specifically is most associated with livestock. And in pristine wilderness areas, it can be present. But it is most commonly associated with livestock and in the low country. They used to refer to it as beaver fever, which is sort of a funny name. But in order to avoid Giardia and all waterborne pathogens, I recommend avoiding water sources that are being utilized by lots of large mammals, and we're going to get into those strategies later. But it isn't super prevalent in the high country, and it's not going to freeze in snow or anything like that. So another common waterborne pathogen is Cryptosporidium. So Cryptosporidium, like Giardia, is very common in heavily recreated areas, actually more so than Giardia. But like Giardia, it's associated with livestock or seasonally migrating animals that have had exposure to livestock, like desert bighorn sheep, antelope, mule deer. Our local black-tailed deer don't migrate, but in some places in Northern California, there are migratory black-tailed deer like Mendocino County, Trinity Alps. Anyways, my point is just those animals could be exposed in some stock tank down there in the winter, and then they shoot up to the high country and drink out of that beautiful, pristine lake that you're swimming in and drinking while you're swimming. So that could be Giardia or Cryptosporidium. But Cryptosporidium is actually very common. And they believe that over 80% of the population has actually had Cryptosporidium at one time or another. And a lot of people don't even get treated for it. It just resolves itself. And it's spread through feces of an infected person or animal. And it's a very resilient organism, and it lives in the intestines of infected humans and animals, and is shed in the stool. And it's protected by a robust outer shell, which allows it to survive for long periods of time, even in harsh environments. So unlike Giardia, Cryptosporidium could survive in icy backcountry streams. It can survive practically on land. Like it can survive outside of a host for up to 18 months. And so like the epidemic of folks defecating on the side of the trail that I've noticed here the last couple of years, that is a great way to spread Cryptosporidium and you could just put your hand down, or lay your water bottle cap down on a spot where someone had defecated months ago and you didn't realize it, and it's all normal now, or whatever, and you could end up with cryptosporidium. They rarely test for crypto or giardia, for that matter. They just treat symptoms, but they can be identical to giardia, and though unlikely, it's unlikely that they're as severe or life-threatening. The most important thing to note here is that cryptosporidium is highly resistant to chemical disinfection. So specifically iodine and chlorine dioxide, known as chemical halogens, which we use to disinfect our water. Its large size makes using a filter very easy, as well as using UV disinfection, as long as the water doesn't have a lot of organic matter in it for UV disinfection. But the best way to treat your water is boiling, and we'll talk about that later. But to summarize cryptosporidium, it's very common. It could pretty much be anywhere and in any water source, regardless of how clear and cold it is, or how fast flowing it is. Though fast flowing bodies of water have reduced statistical odds of getting you sick if they're small, and we'll get into that. But the most important takeaway here is that if you're carrying chlorine dioxide or iodine in your kit as a way to disinfect water, it might not get the job done with crypto. Oftentimes, exposure time needs to be significantly longer than what is recommended on the bottle. So 3 hours instead of 45 minutes or whatever it is. But if you can, boil your water. But also, filtration in UV works good for crypto, or cryptosporidium, not cryptocurrency. So we also have bacteria. That includes leptospirosis, cholera, salmonella, Shigella, E. coli. Most of those are found in other countries or around urban areas. Leptospirosis is the most prevalent in the backcountry. Some of you might know about that. A lot of canines are vaccinated for it. It's deadly for them. And it's also spread through fecal matter of infected humans or animals. When it is introduced to water, the bacteria can reproduce and colonize that water source. And so it can, a water source infected with leptospirosis can definitely get you sick. And the presence of livestock, like all waterborne pathogens, just increases the risk. So I did a separate side for leptospirosis, and I'm just kind of going to glaze over this here, but in the summertime here, it's not super likely to encounter leptospirosis like it is during the wet season. It's most common in places like Kauai or Hawaii, or just tropical places, Florida, rather than our dry, arid environments. That being said, in those places, it's like everywhere. It's very common. Whereas here, it's a slightly less common, though it could be prevalent in many of the creeks that you hike along. And it is spread through feces as well as urine of infected animals. So most notably, wild hogs can spread it, livestock, and rats, which are three species or three creatures that are very common throughout the Bay Area. And leptospirosis is really only worth mentioning or is a special concern because it's smaller than most bacteria, and its unique size and shape can make it capable of sneaking through some filtration devices. So it's possible that it can get through your filter. Not likely, but it's possible. And so, again, it's best to boil your water or use UV disinfection if you can. It's not a huge concern in the backcountry because it's most prevalent in areas closer to development, state parks, open space. But again, those are the places where people are most likely to get lost. So, yeah, leptospirosis. So let's summarize all that a little bit. That was a lot of information, right? So is all water dangerous? The answer is no. Not all water is infected. And we can actually use strategies to mitigate risk and find water that's safe to drink. And so we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about finding water here shortly. General strategies would include avoiding large bodies of water. And my little rule of thumb is like any body of water greater than 4 feet wide. When you're learning about water, like you are right now, and whether or not it's safe to drink, it's important to understand how water sheds work, or how they look on the landscape, right? And so a river doesn't just come out of the ground just like a roaring river, right? That river is formed up on the mountains by many tributaries, right? So tributaries are smaller creeks, springs, and streams that flow together to create a larger body of water. So one great strategy is to choose a tributary, right? So choose the smallest body of water possible and always ask yourself, what's upstream? Can I hike up there? Can I find the creek that's flowing into this creek, or the tributaries that are creating this creek, right? The farther upstream you go, generally, the safer it's going to be, unless it's a case of like it all flowing out of some bog or pond or whatnot, in which case you'd go to that water source and then you'd look for the tributary to that standing body of water, if you can, right? Which that would involve moving, and there is a strategy to reduce risk without moving, and we're gonna talk about that here. So when you can, choose small bodies of fast-flowing, ice-cold, crystal-clear water. Small bodies of fast-flowing, ice-cold, crystal-clear water are going to be significantly safer to drink from than large bodies of water. And that might be a little confusing to you with all that information that I just gave you about, waterborne pathogens. But I can tell you in my experience, and as somebody who spends over 120 days a year sleeping outside in the woods and drinking from wild water sources, that those small bodies of water not only are very safe, and the reason for that is they're not 100% safe, but they're safer than stagnant water because, one, when water's flowing, it's flushing out the system, right? So as long as the source that it's flowing from is not infected, then that water source itself could have, a rat hop in there, take a drink, take a leak in the water, spread whatever in there. And then you could come along, and as long, if that water's flowing, it's going to flush all of that downstream. And so that's why we want to look for a fast flowing water source. We want to look for a small body of water because that indicates you're high up on the tributaries and you're closer to the source. Smaller bodies of water are seasonally a lot less likely to be infected, particularly during the wet season. And then ice cold, because I don't know why, tastes better. Warm water is more likely to create a habitat more suitable for bacteria, protozoa, and amoeba to reproduce. But I wouldn't be sitting there like you do when you're fishing, like making sure the temperature is right. Don't worry about that. If you got to drink it, you got to drink it. That's the moral of the story. Larger bodies of water are always going to have a higher probability of getting you sick. And that's just the nature of standing water and the likelihood of people swimming in it, peeing in it, animals drinking from it, whatever it might be. So when you are on a standing body of water, if you can, look for a tributary, because looking for a tributary is my strategy. And I know it's very simple, but in my opinion, it's one of the best strategies out there. So what if you can't move? And what about, Jack, you've talked about all this stuff about hiking around, looking for smaller creeks and all that, but what about stuff I should carry, right? What if I can just carry the stuff to make the water safe to drink? What about that? What should I carry? So as far as disinfection goes, there's a lot of different ways you can disinfect water. And what disinfection means is that you're killing everything that could possibly make you sick. Contrary to purification, which actually means removing all the organic matter and not the microscopic stuff that can get you sick. So we're trying to disinfect our water. If we can, purify it if we need to, if it's really muddy or dirty. But mud and particulates don't harm you. It's just that if there are waterborne pathogens, they can kind of hide in the organic matter, and then it becomes a lot harder to disinfect. So if you can, purify that water and filter and get some of that matter out before you disinfect it, that's ideal. So let's talk about disinfection. So chemical disinfection is what I use. That's my primary tool that I have in my pack or with me that I can rely upon in the case of emergency. So I utilize what is known as MSR aqua tabs. They're chlorine dioxide. I've also used potable aqua, which is iodine. I've used aqua mira drops, and I've used bleach actually. And you'd have to look up the exact amount as far as bleach goes, but chlorine dioxide and iodine are the best because if bleach bonds to organic matter in the water, it actually becomes chloramine, which is ineffective at killing anything. So it's a lot less stable than chlorine dioxide and iodine. I use chlorine dioxide because I prefer it. Although that being said, chlorine dioxide is not super effective at killing cryptosporidium. So that's a consideration, and that's a risk I'm willing to take. Um, Out of the crypto, lepto, and giardia, the only one on that list that I'm actually concerned about potentially making me so severely ill that I won't be able to maintain hydration is giardia. So I like chlorine dioxide. I carry MSR Aqua tabs. Just make sure whatever chemical you carry is compatible with your water bottle, meaning you've looked beforehand and you go, okay, it's 1 tablet per liter, or it's, in some cases, it's like 1 tablet per 2 gallons. So you got to buy the right stuff. You got to make sure that you're standardized to the containers you're using. Or if you're using a water bladder, like know how much water is in your water bladder and what 1 tablet will do. You don't want to over treat the water and you don't want to under treat the water, because both of those can be gross and have hazards associated with them. So I like chemical disinfection. I can carry a bunch of tablets, super lightweight, and I can use it if I have to. Filters, on the other hand, they're awesome, but you got to be careful to choose one that's not going to fail on you. And you got to be good at troubleshooting your filter if it does become clogged. And I think all of the backpackers here watching that have extensive experience utilizing water filtration have had the experience where they've needed to either back pressure their filter or flush it out or remove the filter and clean it. I've had filters, like for example, I was dropped in British Columbia for 2 weeks on a trip, and my filter failed on what looked like a crystal clear river, but apparently it had glacial till in it. And that filter failed before it filled 1 liter. And so fortunately I had brought iodine, and I had to use iodine for the remainder of that trip because the water had particulate matter in it that was not visible to the eye that was clogging the filter. I've had horrendous experiences with other filter devices, Sawyer squeeze, stuff like that. I recommend if you are going to carry a filter, you carry an excellent pump filter like the Katahdin Hiker Pro, the MSR Sweetwater filters like that. They're very durable and they're not going to fail on you. Whereas all the other super lightweight ones, you got to use very clean water and run it through that filter. Because if you're running dirty water through it, it's just going to clog and it's going to become an issue. So just make sure you choose a good one and you learn how to use it. But I am a huge advocate for filters, and I personally use one myself. UV disinfection can work really well when the water is super clear. But when you get into situations where it's really muddy or there's a lot of sediment in the water, it's not great. So you really got to run your water through a bandana before you use your SteriPen or your Camelback disinfector or whatever tool you have for UV disinfection. That being said, I do really like UV disinfection, but for survival purposes, I'm going to carry chlorine dioxide and maybe a life straw. But a life straw falls into that category of easy to clog filter. So to be honest with you, I don't carry a life straw. I carry chlorine dioxide. And I also carry a stainless steel water bottle. So the reason I carry a stainless steel uninsulated water bottle, some brands that are popular is like Clean Canteen, stuff like that, is because it's essentially a metal pot that I can boil water in. The advantage to a stainless steel bottle is it doesn't break, right? You can treat water in it with chemicals. Most of the wide mouths are standardized to fit all of your pump filters. You can use it. If you have the right water bottle, you can use it with UV disinfection if you have to. Although I don't use it with UV disinfection, but I'm sure you can. But I carry a stainless steel metal water bottle because if I can get a fire going, I can boil water. And boiling water is actually a 100% way to disinfect water, whereas all of the techniques I listed for disinfection are like 99.9, but none of them are 100. So carry a stainless steel metal water bottle. You can't break it. It makes a loud noise if you're trying to make a lot of noise. You can play some music on it. You can heat up water and make a hot water bottle. You can do all types of awesome stuff. And it's got to be uninsulated, okay? Because insulated water bottles aren't going to work well in a fire. So how do we find water, right? Every landscape has different strategies for finding water, but we're going to go through some hypotheticals here, and I have some photos for you. So number one, look at your topography. Water collects on the lowest point of the landscape. It flows downhill. So we're going to be looking on the lowest point of the landscape. So you're not looking on the tops of peaks for water unless you're looking for snow. And I'm going to try and remember to talk about that here after this. But look in your low points. 2, look for ecological indicators. Okay. Look for plants and trees that need water to survive. The more you learn about nature, specifically about plants and trees and animals, you'll learn what they need, right? Their unique needs. And every one has a unique need, just like us humans. And so you can get to the point where you can actually read the landscape like a map by the presence or lack of presence of a particular species of either plant or animal. So, for example, willow, box elder, cottonwood, sedges, aspen in the high country, those are all great indicators of water, with willow and cottonwood being like the big ones that if they're there, there's water. Sedges as well. But anyways, so look for ecological indicators. You could also look for heavily beat down animal trails traveling downhill. I said earlier to avoid water that a lot of animals are drinking from, if you can. But if it's a matter of life and death, we're going to go drink that water. So you find it however you can. So ecological indicators, sometimes you can smell and hear water from quite a ways off. So when you do come across, like when you're hiking along when you're traversing a hillside along a riparian corridor or a creek bottom or a river or whatever it might be, a lake, just remember the smell, because a lot of times it has a strong smell and there's a change in the air when you get close to water. And I know that sounds kind of like hippie, but it's true. It does have a different smell to it, and oftentimes a different temperature around water. It's what we call an ecothermal corridor. It's where all the cold air sinks and it's a cooler area. And then sound. Water makes a bunch of noise if it's flowing. You can always cock your ears just like this, kind of cup them and aim them in a particular direction. And I bet right now, if you're doing this and aiming it towards the computer, I just got a lot louder. And so utilizing this as a strategy to hear either far off sounds or to kind of dip your head down into a canyon and listen a little bit could be an excellent strategy as far as just assessing whether there's flowing water down there or not. Lastly, we have condensation and precipitation, which can be found on vegetation and collected with a cloth and then wrung out into your mouth. In this photograph here, it's worth mentioning before we move on to some examples of what we just talked about, is the process of what's called coal burning. Coal burning is really interesting because coal burning is a technology in which you create a container that then you could boil water in. And how you boil water in a coal burn container is called rock boiling. Rock boiling is really interesting because it was used in indigenous California extensively due to the lack of pottery, right? And so in order to cook in baskets, you would add hot rocks to those baskets. And so it still, I'm sure, is used in some cases. So we use rock boiling as a way to boil water. So if you can get a fire going and you don't have a container, you can make one and then get rocks hot, throw them in that container and boil water in it. Believe it or not, you can boil water in practically any container that holds water. So that could be plastic, paper, you name it. It could be your shoe. It could be a water resistant hat. It could be a latex glove. It could be a paper cup. It could be a piece of garbage, whatever it is. If it holds water, you can rock boil in it. You can even put a paper cup and fill it with water and stick it straight in the fire, and it'll boil. The water keeps the paper from burning. So that's what's happening here. Is it's a container being made, essentially carved out using the fire. Water is added after it's scraped out, and then rocks are transferred from the fire to that container with some sticks to boil water. When you are rock boiling, you do want to avoid using any like pretty looking rocks. So no crystals, no flint, no chert, quartzite, stuff like that. And you do also want to avoid rocks that are submerged in water, because both of those, crystals and then rocks submerged in water or any high silicate rock, it can explode in the fire and it can be dangerous. So rock boiling is a really good way to disinfect water. It's a slightly more advanced skill, but ideally you got to have your metal water bottle. So briefly, I just want to talk about snow, and then I'm going to talk about this picture. You don't want to eat snow. The reason you don't want to eat snow is because it'll lower your core body temperature, and snow is mostly air. But you can melt snow and drink it. I've survived almost exclusively off of snow for weeks at a time in the high country, and melting snow is a real pain in the butt. So usually what I do is I keep my water bottle about half full. I pack it full of snow, and I keep that snow process of the process of that snow melting kind of just going at all times. And so, yeah, just don't eat it, but you can pop the snow in your mouth, and, you can let it melt in your mouth, swallow the liquid. That's fine. But you just don't want to eat a bunch of snow, because it's just like basically cooling. Your stomach's got so much blood and circulation happening around it that it's cooling your core body temperature really quickly. So yes, you can drink water from snow. I've drank in colored snow just as long as it's not yellow, but oftentimes there's algae and stuff growing in it. Usually I like to dig down so I don't take snow off the surface of a bank. I like to remove the top, 4 inches, and then take snow from kind of the middle. But I've never had any negative experiences drinking snow. So yeah. What we have here is a textbook riparian zone. So this is a photo that Mark shared with me, and you can see the contrast in vegetation and how there's this bright green vein running through this area. In the green grasses kind of drying out as they get further from water. And then you've got this shaded northern facing hillside, most likely covered in dug fir, or what looks like fir. But in this little area here, we have some California bay, we have some big leaf maple. I'm sure we have some willow, possibly some cottonwood in there. And this is just an example of looking for bright, dense green growing vegetation. And it's also an example of water collecting in a low point. So this is what we call a riparian zone. This is condensation and or rainwater on vegetation. You can literally lick it off of the vegetation just like the deer do, or it's a lot more efficient to take a cloth and wipe it on the wet vegetation and then wring that into your mouth or into your container. And I don't think there's any associated risk with doing that. Just don't be wiping it off of animal scat and stuff like that. And you can collect an enormous amount of water from condensation. Just like your shoes can get very wet from walking through a field. In open areas, when the dew drops, you can get gallons. So here we have a standing body of water, right? And likely that this water is infected, in my opinion. Now, one of those corners could be infected, whereas the other may not be. Right? We learned that from hearing about Giardia. But if it is colonized with leptospirosis or cryptosporidium, what can we do to mitigate our risk? We could just drink from it and take the risk. But in this case, we could use a strategy called digging a seep hole, also known as an artesian well. And so you're going to be looking for an area along this bank that's relatively level with the water source or has a very gradual slope. And what you're actually doing is you're digging a hole that's going to go beneath the water level itself, allowing water to soak through the ground, then filling up that hole. And what's happening is the water is being filtered through the earth. So ideally, you can do this like several feet from the edge of the body of water. Though how steep that slope is going to dictate how far you can go. Because without a shovel, you're really not going to be able to dig very deep. And in my experience, it's very hard to drink from a hole that's any deeper than elbow deep. And it's pretty much impossible to dig a hole deeper than shoulder deep when you're doing it with your arm. So I like to dig them about a foot deep and very wide so that I can stick my face into the hole and actually drink from it. Because cupping water into your mouth is a very slow process when you could just go straight to the source and fill up. And so in this case, I would dig a seep hole if I couldn't find a tributary around this water source, or say I was injured or something like that. Right here, we have a flowing body of water, right? A small seasonal creek. And in this case, this bank here on the left right up next to that water source, that could be an excellent candidate for digging a seep hole. Or I could follow this upstream, looking for a small spring flowing into it or the source itself, and I could drink from that. You know, it's hard to say whether or not this water is infected. I just don't know what's upstream of it. But this is a very common sort of water source that you'd come across here in the Bay Area. So here we have it. Can I drink my pee? I know everybody is wondering about this. No. I mean, technically you can drink your pee, but no, it's not going to hydrate you. Nothing but water is going to hydrate you. So drinking urine has the opposite effect, especially in dire situations. And it could be the worst possible thing to ingest if you are dehydrated. So do not drink your pee. I know there's a story about the fellow who got his arm trapped under a boulder and he had to cut it off and then he drank his pee. I think he probably would have survived without the pee. I don't really know, but I do know that drinking your pee is a bad idea. It's pretty much exactly like drinking salt water, and it'll cause a toxic buildup in your system. And yeah, don't drink pee. It dehydrates you very, very fast, and it will actually draw water out of your cells through the process of osmosis. And don't drink soda, don't drink Gatorade, all that stuff. If you're dehydrated, you got to drink water, with the exception being hyponatremia. And hyponatremia is an excessive loss of salts due to drinking tons of water and exerting yourself and sweating. In that case, you know, maybe you could take a salt tab or lick some sweat off, or, you know, I don't know if I'm going to recommend drinking pee, but yeah, you'd need to get some salt. Not likely for you to encounter. It's more of an athlete thing, endurance athlete thing. Along the same lines of drinking pee, right here we have a fish hook barrel cactus. A lot of folks talk about getting liquid from plants and cacti. And you can't just do it from any old plant or cacti because you could poison yourself. But the fishhook barrel cactus is one that is commonly referenced in California as an excellent source of liquid in a desert environment. My experience is that some people, first off, this isn't water, it's liquid. And water is what we need, not just liquid. Liquid can continue to dehydrate us. There's a lot of what I believe is either oxalic or ascorbic acid in this. There's a bunch of acid in it that can make certain people really nauseous. And I've even seen people vomit. So I would avoid getting water from anything other, or liquid, I should say, from anything other than water sources. And sometimes in a dried up creek bed, like this one here, like say it's the summertime and the water's dried up, you know, looking for damp spots along the outside bends in this creek, and digging little holes and prospecting could be a viable strategy to locate water if there is no standing water. And so just because there's not water flowing on the surface doesn't mean you can't get to it below the surface. It just takes some prospecting, especially with these sword ferns and bracken ferns growing right here. So don't drink your pee. Make sure you're drinking plenty of water. Look for water on the low point of the landscape. If you can, disinfect it. If you can't disinfect it and it comes down to it, just drink the water, because it's going to keep you alive long enough to get search and rescue in there to rescue you. But if you're carrying the right tools like chlorine dioxide or some type of water disinfection device, metal water bottle, the ability to make fire, and you're using, you know, risk mitigation techniques like digging seep holes, looking for tributaries, targeting water sources that are small, fast flowing, ice cold, and crystal clear, avoiding large bodies of stagnant water, then your likelihood of getting sick is going to decrease. So let's talk about fire. So fire is an interesting one. And a lot of folks, you know, when they get lost and I start talking about shelter, they go, wow, I'm going to just build a fire. And for starters, that could be extremely dangerous. And two, positive mental attitude in your psychological state and survival is extremely important. And the decision to build a fire is a decision based on your confidence that you can 100% do that. Because if you fail, you could potentially send yourself down some negative feedback loop that you might not recover from. So you can't be making decisions in that state that you're not going to succeed at. It's very important that you make decisions that are going to set you up for success. So you can't always just build a fire, but if you can get a fire going, try it under safe conditions. And we're going to talk about that. So fire can be a valuable skill and can certainly be life-saving in certain situations. You know, practice is essential. The only way to get good at making a fire is to practice lighting a lot of them. And in my advice is carry a lighter and accelerant. Again, there should be 0% chance you're going to fail. And I will show you some pictures of fire by friction kits and stuff like that. But all of those are skills that take a lot of practice, and they're skills that you use to teach you why you should not forget a lighter. So yeah. As far as fire safety goes, don't light a fire in an unsafe or uncontained location, regardless of experience. Pretty much anyone can accidentally start a forest fire. Be mindful of root fires. Digging into the ground can start an underground root fire. So be mindful of that. In dry, gusty weather, our oak savanna habitat is almost a guaranteed forest fire if you start a fire. And so when I say learn how to make fires, I say that assuming that you're not going to be doing that in a dangerous environment or practicing in a dangerous way, because practicing is very important, and getting really good at using your kit is really important, right? So like, you could order some accelerant like Wet Fire or Mini Inferno, or some Bigfoot Bushcraft fire plugs, or the old cotton ball soaked in Vaseline, whatever you have. But practice that in a safe place, because lighting a fire isn't going to necessarily keep you warm all night. It's more something you do to sit in the woods, next to a fire. It keeps your brain at ease. I think everybody here, if you had the choice of sitting alone in the dark versus sitting next to a fire, everyone's going to choose a fire. But there's certain scenarios where a fire is excessive, and you're always going to put more energy into your shelter. So when practicing fire and exercising that skill, just make sure you're doing it in a safe way. And I think everybody can relate to that with the CZU fire and everything that happened. And then always check the regulations. A couple tips for fire in wet weather. Plan, right? So plan. What I mean by that is collect all the materials you need ahead of time and be prepared to light that fire. Have your emergency kit set up, know exactly what you're going to do. Make sure you don't collect any material that's touching the ground. Sticks on the ground are going to have a significantly higher moisture content. You can always do the snap test, where you listen for a clean, audible snap. The stick might not break clean, but if you hear a clean, audible snap, oftentimes the combustion level or the dryness level is low, so that the wood is ideal for combustion. And why you don't collect wood that's touching the ground is the same reason you don't lay your t-shirt on the ground to dry. Wood that's up off the ground, dead wood, is going to be prone to convection, right? Which is going to dry it out. And so anything touching the ground is always wet, even if it's dry out. If you have a knife, you can almost always access dry wood utilizing whittling into wet sticks until you hit dry wood and making shavings with that. You can baton, you can look up that. That's using a small knife to split pieces of wood. But if you have a knife and you have a lighter, you can always make a fire. It's just a matter of skill. And so practice when it's wet. Like, don't go trying to light a fire when it's dry and dangerous. Go light your fire at home in a safe place, and practice on your camping trips when you can. Practice when the conditions are tough. Practice when everything's soaking wet and it's windy and not dangerous windy, but when it's stormy and not possible to light a forest fire. Practice when you think you can't light a fire because it's so wet. Because honestly, if you're going to be lighting a fire, it's probably going to be dark. You might not have a light. It's probably very wet. You're likely very cold. You're not going to have great use of your hands, and you're likely going to be stressed out and operating at a lower cognitive level than you are now. And so you got to get really good at it so you can repeat that and fall back onto your training, right? We don't rise to the occasion. We fall back on our training. What about friction fire? Friction fire is pretty gnarly. I make friction fire all the time, but in my 15 plus years of professional teaching experience, the biggest limiting factor with all fire lighting in general is just practice. With friction fire, I teach it so that people don't forget a lighter ever again. Because when you learn how much work it is to create a fire, you become really good at it, at being prepared, so you don't have to do that again. There are a lot of different ways you can light fire with sticks, and you can get really good at it. You can get to the point where if you have no tools at all, you can light a fire with 100% what's found in nature. Use rocks for knives, rootlets for cordage, It's all about just learning about your landscape. But yes, you can get so good that it's basically like carrying a lighter around, particularly in dry conditions. This is a bow drill kit made with 100% natural materials. That is a rock handhold pecked out using a harder stone to make a groove in it, so that there wasn't as much friction as there is on wood. Then I have my fireboard here, my spindle, big leaf maple branch, same branch. I used a rock to grind down that flat. This is a redwood rootlet as my cord. It's just a green rootlet from a living tree. It has enough tensile strength, if you select the right one, that you can actually use for fire or cordage in general. I have a big leaf maple inner bark tinder bundle with some cambium inner bark of redwood sapwood in there. And then you can see that little coal there glowing. So you can do it with no tools, just your wit. This is a fire plow. Unlikely you're going to get that here in California, but it's a Polynesian technique or Pacific Islander technique of rubbing sticks together to make fire. This is a hand drill, which is more like what folks used, indigenous people use in this area and throughout North America. And this is an interesting adaptation. So with hand drill, you need a really long straight stalk. And so in this case, what I did is I found an ideal piece of buckeye, right? But it wasn't straight. It was only a little section. But there was all this French broom growing around, right? Which is invasive. So the French broom is super straight. So all I did is I snipped off a nice piece of French broom, stripped off the bark, twined it up into some cordage, attached my little piece of buckeye to the base of the broom stalk, grabbed the buckeye branch, burned it in, made a coal. All right, we're almost done. Let's talk about food. So the biggest thing with food is, one, there are major risks associated with eating stuff off of the landscape that you're unfamiliar with. Food takes a large amount of investment, study time, practice time, field time, for you to become competent enough and like I should say, like ecologically literate enough to like be able to feed yourself off the landscape. And even the best that are out there have a hard time doing that. So when we talk about food, we're talking about food that's in your backpack. And you're not going to be profiting off of your caloric investments if you're foraging in nature. It's highly unlikely. So it's important to consider caloric investments. So calories are essential for your metabolic processes, especially in cold weather and especially for heating your shelter. When it comes to food, the mom mentality is the ultimate. There's no such thing as too many snacks. There's no such thing. You can fill your backpack with snacks. You can snack your way through an emergency situation, and at least you won't have low blood sugar and you won't get hangry. And again, what's in your pack is your best option. Wild foods are great, but they do pose a risk. And there have been cases where hikers have eaten wild foods, accidentally misidentified them, and died here in Santa Cruz County. And they died. They were able to make a 911 call in one case, but were both dead before the ambulance arrived. So you got to learn your hazards first. Learn what you can eat and then go from there. And I just want to remind everybody, 3 weeks without food is a long time, but we can do it. So in a short-term survival situation, practical survival skills, food isn't a priority. It's a risk. It's a much greater risk than it is a reward unless it's in your backpack. So make sure you carry plenty of snacks, carry stuff that's going to give you energy, and carry stuff that, feels good to eat. So if it's Snickers bars, it's Snickers bars. If it's cashews, it's cashews. If it's, whatever it is for you, whatever gives you energy and nourishes you is what you should carry. The whole adage of like, oh, I carry a can of dog food in my survival kit because I know I'll only eat it if I'm starving. Like, no, don't do that. Just have some self-control. And that is a real thing. People do that, not me. This right here, these are acorn weevils. When I do teach food in my courses, I talk about survival foods. Survival foods are foods that require very little caloric investment to collect. And we don't have time to talk about that in this presentation. And it doesn't really pertain to short-term survival. But these are a commonly found grub called acorn weevils. And they're found in acorns. And you can collect a lot of them very easily. All insects should be cooked. They can carry a lot of parasites, but there are a number of edible insects. There are also a number of inedible or poisonous insects. Some of the most common edible insects around here include acorn weevils, termites, roly-polies, pincher bugs, crickets, grasshoppers, June bugs, earthworms, banana slugs, if they're prepared correctly. They got to be deslimed. And no, They do not taste good. And a few other ones, ants, stuff like that. But don't go just eating raw bugs. You'll give yourself parasites. But bugs are probably number one on the survival foods list because you can collect them while expending very little calories. So in conclusion, there's no such thing as too big of an adventure if you're prepared. Have the mom mentality. You can never have too many snacks, and you can never bring, I mean, you could bring too much water physically to carry, but just bring enough water to keep yourself hydrated. And most importantly, don't assume your trip is going to end on time. Always assume you're going to be out there longer than you expect. If you can just follow that along with the mom mentality, dress appropriately, look at the weather, you're never going to become one of these people that gets lost and requires rescue, or at least if you do, you're going to be alive. You know, I also hope that it's came across in this presentation that it's very important that you learn your ecosystem. When we look to the experts of survival, it's indigenous peoples, because to them survival is daily. It is daily life, especially ancestral life ways. And so if you learn about nature, you'll learn that it's like a big giant like Walmart, or I don't know, some store like that, where you have everything there, your food, your medicine, your tools, it's all there. You just have to learn how to see it. You got to learn how to use it. But if you spend the time and energy to do that, nature becomes your home. And it is our habitat, right? We're an animal. We're humans. We're not supposed to be sitting here on the couch looking at a computer. We're supposed to be outside, sleeping on the ground next to a fire with a bunch of other humans, right? And so I think it's important just to recognize that the more you know about nature, the less likely you're going to stumble into some hazard and accidentally get hurt. The more at home you're going to feel, which is going to lead to being calmer if you do get lost, right? One of the biggest reasons people panic when they're out in the woods is because they're scared of the environment they're in. And the best way to ease that fear is to learn about that place. You'll remember I showed you a photograph of that mountain lion. And I wasn't afraid at all because I know about mountain lions. And I knew it didn't pose a threat to my safety at all. And if it did do something crazy, I was in a position to quickly defend myself and scare the lion away so neither of us would be hurt. So learn about your ecosystem. It's essential for survival. And lastly, practice what you carry with what you carry. I know I didn't talk about a lot of specific gear items, but it should include adequate clothing in your backpack, right? Even if it's not cold then, it could get cold later. What if you rolled your ankle? What if you got stuck? You might want that puffy jacket or that raincoat. It's going to include a knife, a fixed blade knife. You could carry a folder, but having a small knife is excellent. I recommend this knife called the Mora Eldris. It's a very small fixed blade knife. There's not a pin holding it together like a folding knife. And they work so well, and they can be used for so many different things in survival, and they're almost an essential tool in survival. So clothing, a knife, a lighter, or at least what we call an ignition source, along with an accelerant, water, means of disinfection, container to carry your water in, which usually is just comes along with water, right? You're not just carrying it in your hands. Food, and then whatever you need to be comfortable. You just pack accordingly. Pack for the weather. Plan to be out there longer than you expect to be. Always tell someone where you're going and when you're going to be back. Unless you're like me, where you don't like to do that, and then because you have secret spots that you don't want people to know about. And then you just carry an emergency beacon. Never rely on your cell phone. Don't rely on All Trails or Gaia or Onyx or base maps to save you. It's very important that you spend time paying attention to the place that you're in. If I had to leave you with one like little tip, or kind of what I see happening over the course of my career, is I see smartphones distracting people from nature. And lost person situations are becoming increasingly common due to not paying attention. So get off your phone and look at the place that you're in, because that's why you're out there anyways. And I think it's just important to tell you why, and hopefully this presentation explained why that's so important. But most of these lost person situations would be averted if people just paid attention to their surroundings, and use their senses. And so I recommend getting off your phone, looking at the place you're in, looking at a map beforehand, carry an emergency beacon if you need to, embrace the mom mentality, and just have a good time and go on lots of adventures. And I hope that none of you will ever have to use these skills. But and I also hope everyone enjoyed this presentation. And if you're interested in coming and taking a class or learning more, you feel free to check out my website. It's just jackharrisonsurvival.com. You can also find me on Instagram, Jack Harrison Survival, or check out Adventure Out for all my other courses. And most importantly, go outside and get lost, but then find your way back out. And that's it. Thank you, guys.
My gosh, Jack, I'm blown away right now.
Thank you.
You have a whole bunch of new fans. Basically, there's a lot of folks expressing their appreciation. I'm frankly impressed with all of you who are here still. Really, really dedicated audience, because that was a lot, and I learned so much. Folks have been just sharing along the way how much they learned, and so I just got to say, Jack, thank you. That was a labor of love right there.
Yeah, thanks everybody for sticking in there. I wasn't timing myself or anything, so and I apologize if the info, I normally do these lectures in the field, and so presenting on the internet like this with talking points is new to me, and so if there's something I left out, feel free to email me or ask a question. I know we went over, so I'll respect as far as Mark, as far as whatever you want to do. But I'm, if we have time, I'm happy to answer questions. Otherwise, if not,
right. Yeah, well, I could for sure see how you're teaching, or folks could teach entire courses on fire and water and shelter and wayfinding and all that. So you did just an incredible job of summarizing those categories and laying it out. And if folks are left with questions, yeah, it's hard to imagine where you even start with questions now, because we covered so much. But I'm gonna just ask a few.
I did see one thing that popped up in the chat that I saw a mention of a survival blanket and an emergency blanket. And emergency blankets can be very helpful, though outside of medical emergencies, they can pose a certain problem, and that is they do not breathe. And there are varying degrees of quality in emergency blankets, and I do recommend that should be in your kit, because they can be used incredibly for signaling. They're very reflective. They're known as Mylar blankets. The idea is they reflect your body heat back onto you. The problem is if you're dry and you're wearing cotton, your perspiration might collect in that blanket and might actually result in you getting super wet. But if you have a good one, they can save your butt in a bad spot, and they can be used in conjunction with debris to make a pretty excellent shelter. Just be really mindful of the fact that some of them are cut really small and like it's like a 4x4 square, and others are very delicate. Like you could flick it and tear a hole in it. So that is an excellent piece of gear that I didn't mention. And certainly I recommend people carrying with whatever they feel good about carrying. My whole point was to emphasize that regardless of what you're carrying, there are mind states and ways of getting around needing gear. Gear is always better when you have it, for sure. I'm not going to deny that. But if you learn the skills you need to learn, there are options with no gear. And I believe it's better to know how to survive with no gear than it is to just know how to survive with gear. The reason is if you do get lost and you have some gear because you were prepared, now you're just camping. Inconveniently camping. So.
Yeah, and I mean, you said it so many times, but just to emphasize it again, the importance of practice with every gear item that you have. I want to just emphasize one thing. We do a lot of guided hikes at Post, and many of our partners do as well. And we're noticing this more and more just in the past few weeks. Of course, it was cold the past few days, but it's been warming up. And this is when folks start really experiencing that they didn't bring enough water, So it's so basic. So just a quick plug again. So many folks don't carry enough water. So please think about that. Um, Real quick, just choosing out of a bunch of questions here, Jack. I'm just gonna
Yeah.
ask two or three. But you talked about drift walking. That was such a weird thing. I didn't know, that some folks just have a shorter leg and they kind of walk to one direction.
Yeah.
But just a quick tip about, reemphasize and there's a bunch of different reasons why you might drift in one direction, but just a quick tip or two about how to avoid that again. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So lateral drift is just a phenomenon that's like commonly referenced in land navigation, and it's the reason people utilize terrain association or an azimuth or a declination. It's just a reason that you use anything to travel in a straight line. Humans are almost incapable of walking in a straight line without some type of a terrain feature. And there are a lot of stories of folks getting lost, like back east. I know a lot of hunters over back in like the 90s, 80s and 90s were getting lost. And you'd hear these crazy stories of them being tracked and walking in big circles and circles and walking over their own tracks, like,
right,
and so the best way to avoid that is just to be mindful of it and to recognize that, and in a lot of these cases, when they were walking in circles, they'd shed articles of clothing and just make decisions that us in our rational state, not in our sympathetic nervous system response, would not be able to kind of comprehend, like, why are they doing this, but in their brain, it's the right thing to do. And so just recognizing that there's a possibility of, if you think you might be walking in a straight line, but you're not actually following terrain features or using any type of navigational tool, then it would be wise to really be mindful of that and use terrain features or a navigational tool, because otherwise you will walk in circles. And I've actually been a part of the exercise I described when I talked about that, where we tried to walk in a straight line through a bunch of salmonberry that was like 10 feet high to another road. And nobody made it to that road. And we all had GPSs to track what we did. And basically, in the span of a couple hundred yards, everybody ended up walking like back on themselves and bumping into each other. And these are all hardcore nature people. So
wonderful.
hopefully that elaborated a little bit.
Yeah, and that's great. And I'm just reminded of what you said about nature appreciation as a tool, and just like really focusing in on your hike and just observing different trees, different rocks, being just super aware of where you're walking and where you're going. I do that all the time. In addition to keeping just major terrain features, like we were sharing in chat earlier, in the South Bay, you could orient around certain large landmarks,
Yeah.
get a rough direction.
Yeah.
Uh, but the smaller things, just being really knowing the trail that you're on.
Yeah.
Uh,
Story lining or song lining and just making up, like, that's what I do with a lot of teens and young adults is, we'll like go on a hike and we'll do that. I won't tell them what we're doing, but we're coming up with the story while we're doing it. And then at the end, I go, hey, take me back to camp. And then if they're like, what? And then I tell them, like, well, we made up the story. Let's just say that story. And then we use that to get back.
right. Amazing. All right, you all, we're at 2.5 hours. This has been incredible. I'm just gonna say we're good there, but I want to honor one last question
Yeah.
from chat, which is from Zane. A youth audience member. She says they say they're a teen
Right.
uh, who would like to learn more primitive skills, and it's a nice segue into just sharing about where to take classes.
Yeah.
But any tips for where a teen could go to learn a bit more?
Absolutely. So there are a lot of different opportunities for young people or adults or anybody really for that matter to learn um, either survival or primitive skills or ancestral life ways or bushcraft or whatever it is. And there, most of them are like programs that do cost money. Some of them have scholarships, but I offer a lot of different classes here in Boulder Creek, so just over the hill in Santa Cruz, and travel around for that a little bit as well. There's also, the Rikus Center, which has a teen program specifically for young people, and they do a number of different, skills as part of their program, and I think they offer a lot of youth programs specifically geared to that. And as far as like groups and stuff, there isn't anything that comes to mind. There used to be at Coyote Hills, there was a fellow that worked there that his name is Dino Labastay, and he would offer free weekends of like flint napping and, making the stuff that's like in the background there, all the stuff I made. And so he would offer, things like that I actually utilized as a teen. And so what I would recommend doing for Zane is just going on the internet and looking up, reaching out to me, and just kind of taking a look at those opportunities. There's also the Buckeye Gathering, and I believe that's happening. It's one of those primitive skills gatherings here in California. There's the Buckeye Gathering, and then there's the Acorn Gathering. Buckeyes in Sonoma or something like that, and Acorns down in Santa Barbara. Both of those would be awesome for Zane to make it to if they're interested in primitive skills, because you will meet so many people. There's also Headwaters Outdoor School up in Mount Shasta, which for teens and young adults, I highly recommend. They can do work trade programs. You can pay. It's like Tim, who runs that school, had a profound impact on me as a teen. And you go live in like bark teepees and cook food over the fire and learn incredible skills from amazing teachers and spend some time on this beautiful land in Mount Shasta. And so Headwaters Outdoor School would be one of the places I would recommend they check out. It's an awesome opportunity, and financially, there's scholarships and stuff that they try to make it available for everybody. But as far as like what's coming to mind right now, that's really it.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of opportunities if you were to look it up. So like Rikers Center, Adventure Out, me, Headwaters Outdoor School. Those are the big ones. But I also think if you just kind of like start meeting some folks, then all of a sudden, all these opportunities
doors start opening.
And I do want to mention is that, I didn't have people to do this stuff with for a lot of my life. So like all the stuff you can see behind me there, I made all of this, and flint napping and a lot of these bow building and all these crafts and skills are a big passion of mine. And it's not something I talked about, but I do want to say that if you really want to learn, the information's out there on YouTube and in books. And I've taught myself from a very young age. I started flint napping when I was like 8, 9 years old. And as a young adult and very young kid, as soon as YouTube popped up, I was looking at YouTube. I was reading books. I have an extensive library behind me of survival books. I mean, I've devoured pretty much every book you could possibly read as a kid. And whether it was Tom Brown Jr. or Thomas Elpel or like, it goes on and on and on. Those are or Cody Lundeen. All of those books are excellent. And I just think if you have the inspiration, you don't need somebody there to teach you anything. You just need to go do it. Because people sometimes taking classes is great, but what I see not happening is people practicing. And if you have the motivation to just figure it out on your own, I can guarantee you're going to learn like 30 times more. And that's how I did it. Essentially, I had mentors, but I moved a lot. And so for much of my life, it was just me in the woods.
That's amazing. Thank you, Jack. And it's just making me think about how for so many of the different categories of knowledge that we're discussing in these programs, birds, plants, animals, wildlife tracking, local history, indigenous history is just a lifelong journey, and it never ends. And developing a relationship with the environment and this place that you live, different types of habitats, it's so fulfilling, and you could just invest yourself forever. And as soon as you start seeking out that knowledge, just all these different doors of more knowledge open up, and it's a awesome way to describe it. And I just want to say, you inspired a lot of folks tonight, Jack. Thank you again. I'm going to pull up your website here.
Sweet.
JackHarrisonSurvival.com. So you could check out Jack there, and review the chat actually on Facebook and YouTube. There's a lot of links we shared, and background info, and some other local folks who have a lot of knowledge share their knowledge too. So check that out. And I also want to encourage you all to check out our next program, openspacetrust.org/events. We have an awesome woman named Kate Marienchild, who's a Oak Woodlands expert, who's going
Sweet.
to speak next week, or not next week, next month, and many more programs. So that's it for tonight, Jack. Great job again. Thank you so much for the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And again, if you guys have questions, feel free to reach out. I'm horrible with email, but I'll probably get back to you eventually. I know when Mark reached out, it took me like a few months just to get back to his initial email. But I'm more than happy to help in whatever way I can to encourage anyone to go learn and get access to this information. So please don't hesitate to reach out. And if you don't hear back from me, it's not because I didn't see it. It's just, or it is because I didn't see it because I don't check my email and I'm off in the woods.
Yeah, you're out in the woods.
Yeah.
Awesome, Jack. All right, man. Well, thank you again, and have a good night, everybody.
Thank you.
All right. See ya.